Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Disability Inclusion Summit. Just while all our participants are joining, you'll be able to see on screen that we have some recommended viewing settings for you. Just to run through those, if you're seeing any blank screens or profile pictures, you can hover over those and click Hide Non-Video Participants. That way you'll be able to see just our panel who are talking. And we recommend that you continue to watch in gallery view as well. You have the option to submit your questions for the panel using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And we also have closed captioning available, which you can select, and you'll be able to choose your font size there as well. So we'll just continue to wait a few moments while some more of our participants join, and we'll be starting shortly. Hello all. For some of our new attendees, just to note, we have some housekeeping options on the screen for you there, where you can hide your non-video participants if you're seeing any blank screens. You can use the Q&A button to submit questions for our panel throughout. And we also have closed captioning available, which you should see on the bottom of your screen, CC button, where you'll be able to have closed captioning. Okay, and with that, Vaibhav, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Vaibhav Adlaka, and I'm an associate at Reed Smith. On behalf of the firm, I would like to welcome you to the Reed Smith Disability Inclusion Summit, focusing on the championing the talent of people with disabilities. Dr. Martin Luther King had a dream and spoke of truths that are self-evident. He spoke of a dream that every person should be treated as equal, regardless of race, caste, creed, and other social norms. These words were spoken in the context of segregation and hold importance today due to the Black Lives Matter movement. However, if we consider the deeper meaning of his words, they also have wider implications and great significance for the issues that will be discussed today. In relation to, apologies, in relation to creating an environment that allows for openness and authenticity to flourish, giving every person the opportunity to progress. In my view, disability is a mindset that influences perceptions. It is something that society creates when things are done differently. And if we remove the letters DIS from our convictions and beliefs, we will not allow a lack of understanding and awareness or unconscious bias to influence our perspective. Only then, in my view, is it possible for true ability to be realized. This is what we should all strive to achieve. That is, to give everyone an opportunity and platform to thrive, as well as recognize the fact that we all make valuable contributions. With regard to diversity, inclusion, and culture, it is important that we take an intersectional approach, as no single characteristic is a monolith. We must recognize that individuals are complex and multifaceted. Hence, individuals with disabilities also include women, LGBTQ+, race and ethnicity, social mobility, and so on. With this view in mind, Reed Smith set up the group, looking for excellence and advancement for people with disabilities at Reed Smith. In 2012, taking inspiration from the Paralympics, the desire of this group was to attract, support, and promote people with disabilities, helping them to enhance their professional, personal, and career development. We had realized that people with disabilities were underrepresented in many professions. There was a gap in, in perspective, which meant that this particular group of talented individuals was falling through the cracks. In any event, having a diverse workforce allows organizations to broaden their outlook and opens them to new ideas. We believe that values and ethics form part of the firm and human brand, and thus, in a world where everything requires a justification or a business case, ours was simple. It was just the right thing to do. We hope that the panels we have outlined relating to what perceptions exist regarding disability, why employing people with disabilities is good for business, and how the modern workplace has impacted those with disabilities in the COVID-19 environment will facilitate conversations that matter, as well as discussions that either help you to dispel misconceptions or confirm progressive ideas. It is important to begin at the grassroots level to ensure that people with disabilities are aware of the opportunities that are available to them. During this summit, you may hear different terminology being used, since references may differ between the UK and the US, and indeed from person to person, depending upon an individual's approach to disability rights. Our panelists include people from both jurisdictions. And please be assured that no offense is intended when panelists use the term that is most familiar to them. Prior to coming here today, many of you completed our Perceptions on Disability survey that outlines some of the thoughts and concerns of both people with disabilities and potential employers, while also analyzing the degree to which the workplace is diverse and inclusive. We thank you for your honest response and hope that it will assist you to first acknowledge the need for change and then help to facilitate that change. I wanted to share with you some of the trends we have noticed so far. And some of these include that for the most part, participants believe that employees with disabilities are essential, possess the essential attributes necessary to be a good employee, while loyalty is the top characteristic attributed to people with disabilities. Adaptability is the topmost characteristic expected in all employees. There's also a strong desire to create the perfect environment for both businesses and employees, together with a willingness to adapt in order to be inclusive. However, some of the barriers to employment also include biased mindsets and perceptions that people with disabilities are incompatible with the work environment. Furthermore, people are cautious about disclosing physical disabilities, and there is a moderate acceptance regarding inclusion and belonging. Thus, there is an opportunity for growth in these areas. The survey will remain open until the 15th of December. We hope that you will have the opportunity to share your thoughts and/or provide a different perspective with renewed understanding, hope, and vigor after the summit. Perhaps the greatest risk any of us will ever take is to be seen as we really are. This quote from the movie Cinderella is one of the most powerful, valuable lessons I have learned. It is my sincere hope that the summit provides a platform to truly and openly express ideas, concerns, and doubts so that we can facilitate creative solutions together, as well as cultivate an atmosphere of positivity. Before I close and let the summit begin, I would like to leave you with some parting thoughts. Do not let someone's identity be judged by preconceived perceptions. Everyone can contribute if the right environment is created, together with the right approach and a positive attitude. Change, however, is not instant, and neither does it guarantee immediate success. However, the best we can do is try. And as Samuel Beckett says, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. Today, as you hear powerful stories, share experiences, and collect memories, please do not underestimate the power you possess to change the world, as it requires only a small group of thoughtful and committed individuals to do so. This summit represents our attempt to facilitate change and fulfill our responsibility to showcase, celebrate, and champion the talents of people with disabilities beyond the legal profession. We have recognized the value that this underrepresented group of people have added to our organization through their ability to think differently and the qualities that they have gained through their experience, endurance, and perseverance. It is our sincere hope that after this summit, you will share our vision as well. Thank you very much for supporting our endeavor. We are proud to have among us Victoria Cleland, Executive Director for Banking, Payments, and Innovation at the Bank of England. She leads the teams responsible for the operation and strategic development of the bank's payment system services and the wholesale and retail banking operations. Victoria is also the chair of the Committee of Payments and Market Infrastructure Task Force on cross-border payments. She has held various senior positions in a range of areas at the Bank of England, such as Chief Cashier, Deputy Head of the Special Resolution Unit, and the Private Secretary to the Deputy Governor. Victoria is an executive sponsor of the Bank of England's Disability Network and Bicycle User Groups, and is a board member of the Business Disability Forum. It is now my honor to invite Victoria Cleland to share her thoughts. Thank you very much and enjoy your experience.
Thank you ever so much, Vibhav. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think you've really set the scene in terms of positivity. I think that's great. And also, I think we should all thank you. This is your brainchild. I know without you, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you for the inspiration behind that. And also a really big thank you to Reed Smith for arranging this summit. For me, it's a real privilege to be here celebrating the International Day of People with Disabilities. It is something special. But disability is often forgotten amongst diversity strategies. The key focus for many people when they think about diversity and inclusion has tended to be much more on, for example, women and BAME. One of the key things I want to sort of focus on is how we can be more diverse in our diversity strategy. And sometimes stats work, and you may say, well, as a central banker, we always like statistics, but I think some here are really telling. Recent data shows that approximately 19% of the working age people are disabled. But if we dig deeper into this, it's even more eye-opening. 80% of disabilities are acquired between the ages of 18 and 64. So this really is something that we need to think about. These are enormous numbers and something that can potentially impact all of us. I think these numbers also sort of open our minds to the fact that actually not all disabilities are visible. There are a lot of invisible disabilities, for example, neurodiversity, dyslexia, some long-term sickness. And while we can't necessarily see them, they'll have at least as much impact on the individuals as some of those more overt disabilities that we sort of focus on. So I think it's really important that we all, and that means everybody who's here listening, watching the webinar, do what we can to enhance the lives of staff and people with disabilities. But it's not just because we feel that we should do it. It's also a way to help us attract great talent, both through looking through what we may see as a people's sort of disability and really focusing on what is the ability. That is what we really want to look at. And in the Bank of England, we have a disability network, and actually the way that's sort of written down, it starts with a small d, but when we get to the A for ability, we use a capital. We want to really focus on the ability and the talent. And sometimes you can get real strengths from at the heart of the disabilities. So for example, there's been quite a lot in the press recently about Greta Thunberg, and she herself has suggested that maybe it's her autism that has really enabled her to achieve so much. She says she sees black and white and other people see grey. So there's a real question in how we can really harness this. Greater diversity can help to move away from groupthink and have much better results for organisations. And a key theme of the Valuable 500, which is a global movement that's really trying to put disability at the heart of business leaders, is to show that actually business can benefit from disability. The Bank of England last year was one of the organisations to sign up to the Valuable 500 and really start trying to promote the message. I'd like to highlight a few things that the Bank of England has been doing in this space to really think about our staff, but also those who we serve, so the public of the UK. And one of the main areas that I can talk about are some of the physical changes that have been made to the building, so more accessible toilets now on every floor, hearing loops in meeting rooms. We also introduced a new wheelchair entrance, and actually Claire Harvey, who I think is one of the panelists later, came and cut the ribbon on that for us. And actually that was no mean feat. We have a grade 2 listed building, so we're working hard to make some of these structural changes. But to my mind, the physical changes, they're only really the start of the journey. They're the foundations that make it possible for people with disabilities to join us and visit us, but they're not enough. I think if we really want people to thrive, not just to survive, we want them to thrive, we need to think about changing the culture, how to enable them to really make a difference. So one of the areas that the bank is really focused on is our strong disability network, which is a staff-led network, where they're trying to improve the environment for bank staff, but also, and really importantly to my mind, to increase understanding amongst the rest of the bank, amongst managers and colleagues in terms of what are the key issues. So for example, this morning I was hosting a panel event at the bank, or sorry, for the bank, it was obviously virtual, with staff who were talking about some of their journeys, what had been good about joining the institution, where their managers had really helped. And we had a particular focus this year on hidden disabilities. And I think those panel events can be really powerful. The Disability Network also has a number of champions for particular issues such as dyslexia, sometimes just opening up to enable staff to have a conversation and talk about things over coffee. And another really important role that they play is actually making sure that when the bank is thinking about changes to, for example, property or technology, they're there with a voice and can actually help testing at a very early stage. So there's some things that Disability Network are doing, but I think what's really important is also to test how well we're doing compared to other people. So in 2017 and 2019, we went through some benchmarking by the Business Disability Forum. 2017, it was really helpful. It showed, to be blunt, there was a long way we had to go. So 2019, we went through the benchmarking again, and we gained silver, which was a fantastic achievement. And I think what's really important about the benchmarking, it isn't just looking at it as a sort of HR issue, or have you got the right physical adjustments? It's going much deeper into, well, what is your procurement strategy? Is that actually going to support disability? Are you looking into the firms that you're employing, looking into communications? The Bank of England itself doesn't really have customers in the traditional sense. Our mission is there to sort of serve the public of the UK by maintaining monetary and financial stability. But we thought, well, what do we need to do on that? So clearly there are issues around websites, accessible information, but we went a step further. So for example, when we introduced the polymer £10 note a couple of years ago, we actually put a number of tactile features on it so that people with vision impairments could actually feel the difference between the notes. And then when the new 20 came out, that had a different configuration of dots. So that was sort of trying to think, what more can we do for our customers, so to speak. And so getting silver was great, but we don't think that's enough. We're not going to stop there. We really want to go for gold, and that's a strategy that we've adopted. And it's a strategy that was agreed by Court, who are our board. And when we talk about going for gold, we've got a number of sort of strands to that. We've got G is gauge. And at the heart of that is really understanding how many people with disabilities are there in the bank. Getting people to declare has been very difficult, but unless we understand that, we can't know where we need to improve or to monitor our progress against it. So we've got gauge, we've got outside, so learning from other institutions, so that's our go. To get the gold, we've got grow, which is about growing our understanding of the needs of our disabled colleague. Organise, so making sure that we're sort of arranging disability specific training, in particular for managers, to help them support colleagues with disabilities. For L, we've got leadership, and I think that is really important. So leading from the top, getting senior buy-in to the importance of these issues. And for D, we've got the data, which is really trying to increase the declaration rates, understanding what's happening, looking at staff surveys and trying to find out if there are differences between those colleagues who've declared disabilities and those others. So we are very much going for gold in this way, and I hope that will encourage some of the people on this webinar to go for gold themselves. Importantly, to really enjoy the event. There's a fantastic array of speakers, and hopefully at the end, we'll all be inspired to be, as I say, more diverse about our approach to diversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria and Vibab, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining across the globe. We're thrilled to have you join us today. My name is Vicki Tangle, and I'm a senior associate at Reed Smith in the firm's Life Sciences Health Industry Group based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I'm also the associate chair of Reed Smith's disability-focused diversity, equity, and inclusion group, LEADERS, which, as Vibab mentioned earlier, stands for Looking for Excellence and Advancement of Persons with Disabilities at Reed Smith. I'm also your MC today, and we'll kick off each panel with a brief overview of the panel topic and introductions of our moderators and panelists. So let's begin with panel one. The title of panel one is Perceptions Regarding Disabilities versus the Reality. This panel will be discussing the issues of disclosure of visible and non-visible disabilities, the unintended consequences of unconscious and conscious bias, not only within society, but within ourselves, and how this results in impacting professional identity. Our moderators today will be Daniel Winterfield and Danielle Leibel at Reed Smith, and our panelists will be Claire Harvey, Lily Earle, and Luke DeBevic. Daniel Winterfield is a partner in Reed Smith's global capital markets practice. He's currently based in our London office, and his practice focuses on representing US, UK, European, and Asian investment banks and corporate issues and a wide range of security transactions. Daniel is also the founder and chair of the Interlaw Diversity Forum, which seeks to promote meritocracy and inclusion for diverse groups in the legal sector. Since its founding in 2008, the Interlaw Diversity Forum has expanded its scope beyond LGBT+ to encompass all strands of diversity and inclusion, including race and ethnicity, disability, gender, and social mobility, with a particular focus on cultural change in the workplace and multiple identities intersectionality. The Interlaw Diversity Forum currently has more than 8,500 members and supporters from over 300 law firms and chambers and over 500 corporate and financial institutions. Thanks for moderating, Daniel. Danielle Leibel is an associate in Reed Smith's real estate practice group and is located in Reed Smith's San Francisco office. Danielle's practice focuses on commercial leasing and sales and acquisitions. Danielle is also a national ambassador for the Special Olympics and has developed numerous programs and initiatives for the organization centered around inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities on and off the sports field. Because of her work, Danielle has been featured in the book Stand Up, 75 Young Athletes That Rock the World, named one of ESPN's 50 game changers, and has been invited to speak at various venues, including the White House in 2014. Currently, Special Olympics inclusive programming services more than 3 million people with and without disabilities throughout the United States. Thanks for moderating, Danielle. As I mentioned, our panelists today are Claire Harvey, Lily Earle, and Luke Dubevic. Claire is an experienced senior leader inclusion expert and Paralympian. Previously working as head of inclusive leadership at KPMG, Claire is now recognized as a world leader in diversity, inclusion, and culture, incorporating change management and leadership behaviors into impactful programs. Since 2018, Claire has been working as an independent consultant under her own brand, Anata, and has supported global large organizations, government agencies, NGOs, charities, universities, and schools. Her current long-term projects include supporting raising inclusion and attainment across schools in Latin America and supporting the Houses of Parliament and increase inclusion and public trust. Lily works for Kaleidoscope Group as a talent acquisition manager. She is a careers and employability specialist, disability equality advocate, integrative psychotherapist, and mentor, motivated by combining her diverse skill set with 24 years of lived experience of multiple hidden disabilities to make a meaningful difference in the lives of others, increasing human capital and social mobility through awareness raising, education, connection, and engagement. And lastly, Luke Dubevic joined Reed Smith in 2008 and is a partner of the firm's insurance recovery group based out of the firm's Philadelphia office and practices openly with a disability. Luke is a co-founder and board member of Leaders, Reed Smith's Business Inclusion Group. Thanks so much, panelists. For panelists one, take it away.
Everyone, I'm Danielle. You get the Danielle and the Danielle combo today. So for our first question for the panelists, we're just going to dive right in and talk about perceptions of disabilities. So panelists, how do individuals' perceptions differ when it comes to visible disabilities versus invisible disabilities? And how does this create an unconscious bias or just a bias?
Thank you, Danielle. I'm quite happy to go first, be the brave one that goes first. Obviously, it's a very kind of challenging question, but it's one that I'm incredibly passionate about. So, I mean, first of all, I just want to say thank you for being given the opportunity to speak today. This theme is incredibly close to my heart, as I'm faced with the belief that if a disability isn't visible, it isn't real on a daily basis. No one would know unless I choose to share that behind my smile and bubbly personality, I have lived with very aggressive Crohn's disease since I was 8 years old. But my life changed overnight when at 17 years old, I had an operation that went badly wrong, resulting in septicemia, peritonitis, and organ failure. This meant for 12 years, I was kept alive via a feeding line that went directly into a main vein in my heart. During that time, I was living with chronic sepsis, had 8 further life-threatening operations resulting in long stints in intensive care, and ultimately led to me losing 90% of a crucial organ, my bowel, aka our second brain. And let's face it, nobody wants to talk about bowels. I share this as a survivor, not because I want sympathy or pity or special treatment, the opposite. I want to feel empowered and enabled to no longer feel invisible, to encourage understanding that just because a disability isn't visible doesn't mean it isn't real. I wish for my abilities, born from the obstacles I have faced, to be seen. I am an abstract and lateral thinker. I am a creative problem solver. I have an inner radar for the nearest toilet. I'm incredibly resilient, hardworking, loyal, and adaptable. And it has taken me until this year to feel confident to say that. Now, working at Kaleidoscope Group, I meet incredible intersectional disabled candidates every day, and I see these valuable skills and many more across the board, which is such a gift. Every person has a unique story and relates to their own disability differently. So I believe the more we unite and share our unique stories to remind people to be kind, as no one can truly know another's truth or obstacles they face. We all have a story to learn from, and when humankind remain open and listen compassionately, and most importantly, make change, we can create meaningful difference in the world. I realise now that unless I dare to use my voice to facilitate and encourage awareness and shifts in mindset, then stigma and discrimination continues. If I can help just one person feel connected, less isolated and alone, then it is worth me feeling hugely vulnerable and exposed. My hope is from sharing, it will help remind people that 1 in 4 people live with a disability, and of those, only 8% use a wheelchair. There's likely to be far more people in your organisation than you realise that just haven't disclosed. I want to help shift mindsets and culture so people feel empowered, valued, and truly supported when they do disclose. 80% of disabilities are hidden, so always be kind and remain open. Currently, only 4% of businesses are focused on making offerings disability inclusive. Imagine a world where we can truly feel a sense of belonging and bring our authentic selves to work. If 15% of the world population lives with some sort of disability, let's see proportional representation. And more than that, let's see proportional representation at the decision-making table. That's kind of what I feel.
Well, I'm nodding along and agreeing with you, Lily. I share a lot of what you've said. As a person with a disability, epilepsy, that's only occasionally, rarely visible. And, you know, I'm a white cisgender male, and I made it to the age of 32 or 33 without suffering from any type of issue or not identifying as a person with a disability, not suffering a disability, having a disability. And then suddenly I had seizures as I was up for promotion. And when I think about invisible disability, I think about, you know, whether to disclose something or not, whether to let somebody see me in a vulnerable situation, or to express a vulnerability and to express a need, you know, and as an attorney, I think we're very hardwired in our profession to not want to express vulnerability, to not want to identify a characteristic that you might need assistance with to make your ability shine through. I had a seizure in the middle of a partner meeting, and so it was immediately visible to everybody. And so I think a lot of the self-disclosure pain was taken out of my equation because it was a little bit more just kind of carrying through with the revelation to everybody of what was going on. And I found that the invisibility of the disability is tough not just for other people, but for myself. Because if I'm not having a seizure, it doesn't really always feel real in terms of disability. People with disabilities all experience theirs differently, and people with epilepsy experience it differently. Some people, don't even have perceptible seizures that you see. But, I've had brain surgeries, I'm on all sorts of anti-epileptic drugs and all sorts of things that impact my practice that I've had to adapt to and that people wouldn't even know about. And so you're repeatedly faced with the question, and we'll talk about it later, of disclosure and who to disclose to and when and why and for what reasons. I'm going to stop and let someone else talk.
So I guess I'll be the 8% wheelchair users. And I really struggle with the term invisible or hidden disabilities, because I don't think very many disabilities are invisible or hidden at all. Humans just aren't curious enough to actually take account of each other's behavior and see things. So, I think we give people a get out by calling things invisible, and therefore, why would you see them? I think the other thing is, and I think that I'm a psychologist, right? So I'll always come back to the social science. People don't think about what they don't immediately see and isn't immediately relevant to them. So if we aren't at a point yet where people don't think about accessibility for someone like me as a wheelchair user, where it's bloody obvious I've got a disability, it's very unlikely that those people are going to be thinking about somebody that might have something that they aren't curious enough to see. And also, when you think about what perceptions on television and perceptions on, when you look at the top 100 children's reading books, for example, there's not a single disabled person in there. So we're bringing up generations that don't talk about disability, don't see about disability. And therefore, it's not that they're intentionally excluding, they're simply not seeing.
Great, thank you, Claire. I think that's really an interesting perspective, because you're right, even with people who have visible disabilities, I have seen people completely operate without any regard to how things work for them or don't work for them. And as you said, part of it is about curiosity, and it's always about getting to know the individual. So if you want to know, what Claire needs in the workplace, you got to talk to Claire. There's, because also just because someone's in a wheelchair and another person's in a wheelchair, they may have totally different needs or other issues going on as well. So you have to get to know everyone on an individual basis. And we're going to talk a little bit later about intersectionality, because I think that overlaps a bit with this point, because there's also the point about, how if you have things that are less visible or less obvious, whether you disclose that or tell can also factor in with that intersectionality point. So I think, thank you all three for that. And thank you all three of you for being so passionate and three really different but really enlightening answers on that point. You lit up the chat box. A reminder for everybody who's listening, please open the Q&A box. You guys do have the ability to chat, but if you have questions or you want to ask questions during the panel, please ask those questions there. You can feel free as well to make comments in the chat box, but please use the Q&A box, everyone. You can open it on the bottom of your screen. So the shifting gears, we're going to talk a little bit about oh, wait a minute. Oh, okay. Well, we just did that one, so I'm sorry. So I'm going to go back up. So we talk about the history of barriers for people with disabilities. So we talked about this, and Claire's answer really touched upon the next question. So what is the history behind barriers for people with disabilities? And let's explain the unintentional perceived perceptions. And Claire has touched on that, Claire. So do you want to maybe dive in and give us your thoughts first, Claire, and then Luke or Lily, if you have something to add to that point?
Yeah, so I think, the first significant legislation around disability was after World War I, when veterans came back from the war and were coming back with disabilities. Before that, disability was seen as, people who were limited, or people who, even in some cultures, people who'd done something wrong in their families and therefore it was a punishment, those kind of things. And I think the fact that legislation was first put in place for veterans is really significant in how we've framed disability in society moving forward. I think it comes with a level of sympathy. It comes with a level of worthiness. You know, some disabilities are more worthy than others. It certainly within the disability community, I think, has come with a level of hierarchy. And we've, you know, no disrespect, Danielle, but we've started the Disability Olympics alongside a million other things, you know, within our own community of who's got more or less disability. But I think that sense of sympathy really shines through, and we have, for me, there are three core elements that really limit. We have that toxic sense of who we are, that self-limiting interpersonal stereotypes. We have emotional or sympathetic responses, and then we have societal insignificance. 1 in 3 people still believe that disabled people are less able and less active. You know, that's a huge amount in 2020. I know I acquired my disability in an accident that comes with a whole level of sympathy. Sometimes when I'm feeling really mischievous, I tell people that, yeah, I was involved in a road traffic accident and I broke my spinal cord, but I was a drink driver. Just to see how people respond very differently. I wasn't, by the way, but it's really fascinating to see where people can't work out whether they should or shouldn't be sympathetic, because we've got this emotional response to disability which we need to lose, and we need to start seeing it as a fact.
Great. Luke or Lily, do you guys have something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, all of the things that Claire has just highlighted, I think, are spot on. And I think so often those kind of less than, or you know, viewing disability as being less can end up internalizing. And I know I speak for myself that even today, I still have that internal dialogue with myself that actually I'm just a human being like everybody else, but there's still times where those kind of self-doubt, imposter voices come in, and where I feel like I'm constantly having to prove myself even more because of this view that, because of the, and then on top of that, because it's invisible, I say invisible, I shouldn't say invisible, but because of the fact that it's not apparent for people that don't want to look hard enough, I think that encapsulates it better. I still feel like I have to, you know, prove myself more. And I think ultimately we're all human beings on this planet figuring our way through surviving, and the more we focus on that and show humility and actually see people as individuals, and not as their label or their, you know, or their disability, the better. Yeah.
So I guess I'm not sure what to say in terms of the history. But, you know, the laws developed, you know, around disability, and we have to think of that, you know, as really, you know, not limiting what an organization like a law firm or business can do. And we need to think about the employment of people with disabilities as the right thing to do. We need to, our global managing partner, Sandy Thomas, mentioned at previous events that, you know, the focus is on meeting our clients on a field of shared values, and it's a value to value people. And there's so many people with disabilities who can contribute to organizations and have great abilities. And I reflect on that every time this comes up, that, you know, when we turn our focus to the protections of the law, we can't let that be a limit. And I'm reflecting on what Lily just said. I found that I am much harder on myself, and I've internalized a lot of, I'll just say, like, anti-person with disability sentiment against myself in a way that I would never to another person. You know, I'll provide, you know, all the support I can to a team member or to a person who calls me up randomly on the phone, but then I'll beat myself up about a comparison to my former self or to my colleagues. And a huge part of turning that corner was therapy and a focus on mental health, which I think is important and can't be disregarded too. And I'll stop there and let someone else chime in.
Great, but I think that's great, Luke. And I think, thinking about what all three of you said, I mean, the great news, we can take comfort when we look at other strands of diversity and inclusion and find, guess what? You see low self-esteem, you see, imposter syndrome, you see mental health issues at higher levels. I think we all within, all disadvantaged groups and along with social mobility as well, experience these feelings. So it is important, as Luke said, to recognize them and learn to overcome them. And we can look at the tools that are available to us. We have a confidential hotline. We have, counseling available through the firm. Most employers have that. You can seek that out in the UK through the NHS. In the US, it's a little bit more complicated, but available. There is stuff available, but it is, I think, really important that people learn to work on that. And that actually leads perfectly to me turning over to Danielle for our next question, which was Luke just did a seamless transition to our next
Yes, topic. Thank you, Luke. And thank you, Danielle. I think one topic that a lot of employees with disabilities kind of want to convey to their employers and others is that they possess the same ability as their coworkers that don't have a disability. And I know in my work of inclusion, it becomes very controversial of how do we frame that story, because we don't want to leave out the disability, because that is a part of who someone is. And so I would love to hear from you. How do you think we can change that narrative and create it so employees with and without disabilities do possess the same abilities?
So there's a lot there. I guess I'll just jump in and say quickly that my experience is certainly different than others. So I can't speak for everybody with a disability, but my own experience is I found I had to do a lot of things differently and adapt. I had to ask for help from other people to help me do the things I used to do. I still had a lot of ability. I have the ability to do my job, but the things I had to do to make it work were different. I had to call on a team of people around me. I had to have the support from the culture and the environment. I found people who are still friends who are on this call, partners of mine, who told me I could continue doing what I was doing when I had the most doubt about where I was standing. So a lot of it's just words, I think. The disability versus ability. We have abilities, and they get brought out in teams and in finding the best ways to express them. And I'll stop and let someone else share their own thoughts.
I'm going to slightly disagree, because I think you're absolutely right in concept, but I think we have to understand the societal systemic structures that with which people are growing up in. And we know that young disabled people are, tell me if I'm wrong, Lily, I think it's nearly 30% less likely to have qualifications than children without disabilities. My pet hate is, the language around special educational needs. Children only have special educational needs because the system doesn't account for their needs in the first place. In the same way that we talk about reasonable adjustments, we only need reasonable adjustments because the culture and the rhythms and the ways of workings of our organization have been designed without thinking about disability first. So I think we need to flip our thinking a little bit away from how do we prove that we've got more ability to how do we help organizations build systems which have disability of any level of inclusion built at the heart of them, so that people don't experience what you were talking about, Daniel, that the link between all of the strands and mental health and self-esteem is what we call the emotional tax of otherness. It's that constant drip feed of the system isn't built for you, the system, and the more we can change the the root cause of that rather than the symptoms, the better we'll be. My favorite analogy is, if a flower doesn't grow, you don't work on the flower, you work on the soil. And we need to think exactly the same about society and our organizations.
I love that. Sorry.
No, go on, Lily, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I love that concept of kind of the flower and the soil, because I think Claire quite rightly highlights that it's a systemic cultural change that we need to focus on to see sustainable and long lasting and meaningful change in society. Because I think quite often with inclusion generally, often it's the things that are kind of the easiest to do, like the more higher level, simple, practical things like technology, for example, which are important. They are important, but they're often the first go-to that when it comes to accessibility and inclusion, it's focused on that first. And instead, I believe that if we focus on the mindsets, we focus on the culture, we focus on the systemic bias that does exist, then we're more likely, it hopefully will create a spiral effect, a positive spiral effect, which will actually mean that those questions aren't even needed anymore, because they were at the start, they were at the heart of the organization in the first place, and not just the organization, but society as a whole. Yeah.
Great, and I agree with that. I think and this leads us great into the next question, because when you look at individuals, when we've done our research within the Interlaw Diversity Forum, we looked at our career progression report in 2000. We surveyed over 2,000 people in the legal sector, and we found that one group did the best within the UK legal sector. That was straight, white, elite, educated men. I know everyone just fainted and they were shocked by that finding. But then what we found was everyone who was different was disadvantaged. And I love the way Claire talked about a greenhouse and plants, but I also think the great analogy is a zoo. What we have right now in our organizations are perfectly built elephant houses. If you want to think of this one group that does so well, they've got its warm temperature, there's hay that they can get to with their little trunks. The problem you have with these organizations are when you start introducing the penguins and the alligators and the birds, they all have really different needs. And so, as kind of Claire pointed out, the issue, the penguin coming along isn't the problem. The problem is the penguin's going to need a cooler temperature. The penguin's going to need a little more water. They play in a different way.
I love that.
And Claire asked if elephants eat hay. They do. I've seen them. They also love peanuts. There's a great picture of me feeding them at the Cincinnati Zoo as a kid. But that is, our issue, our challenge is that culture. We need to look at our culture, and people talk now with Black Lives Matter about looking at, anti-racism and looking at our systems around, promotion, retention, and advancement of talent. And this is our key challenge. But that challenge also becomes more complex when we think about the concept of intersectionality. So when you look at the concept of intersectionality or multiple identities, that coin was termed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor at Columbia University in New York. Originally, the concept was that women, and looking at feminism, are not a monolith, and that feminism was seen as being directed towards white, affluent women. And Kimberly came along and said that the experience of the African-American woman is very different from the experience of the group that the majority of people are talking about in feminism. That concept has now been expanded out. And when we think about intersectionality, we think about people in a complex way. I mean, who is Daniel? You can talk about the fact that I'm, American. You can talk about the fact that I am, openly gay. You can talk about the fact that I have an adult diagnosis of ADHD and treated for depression. You can keep going, but what our research also showed us was the more of those boxes you tick within law in the UK, literally the more barriers you face and the less money you earn. So there is a cost to having that intersectionality, and that also can impact our decision around how much of ourselves we reveal, because sometimes people can just go, I'm exhausted. So what are your thoughts, guys, on your personal experiences or your expertise around the topic of intersectionality and your identity? I'd welcome you guys to share with us, because all of us are multifaceted and complex.
So I'll start by sharing one of my favorite stories, which really brought to life for me the fact that when we think about groups, when having a disability, we think very binary about that. I was in hospital for 9 months with my following my accident, and during that time I went to a session that was returning to sexual activity. I'm sorry for whatever time, if it's too early in the day for you, stop listening. Returning to sexual activity after a spinal cord injury, and it was an hour and a half about heterosexual sex. Now, as a gay woman, whilst I learned an awful lot in that hour and a half that I didn't already know, it served to make me feel even more invisible than when I started. And I think what you were just talking about, Daniel, with the intersectionality, and when I think also about the disability world, humans are lazy and humans like comfort and simplicity. And one of the issues is we need to build cultures where we see everyone as individuals and we have uncomfortable conversations based on co-designing a culture that's agile. And unfortunately, that doesn't work with most organizational cultures, and it doesn't work with human behavior. So we need to do some work to get there first.
And in fact, Claire, I love to tell that story when I illustrate intersectionality. I always borrow that from that panel we did, like 5 years ago in Interlaw, when we did our first panel on disability intersectionality. And you raising your hand being like, some of that stuff you're talking about, we don't have that in my bedroom. We're gonna have to have a different conversation for my rehabilitation. It's such a great example of just how complex individuals are. And I also always think about Catholic lesbian cells who had to go out and found Regard, the first LGBT and disability intersectionality charity, because she felt like she was on the pride marches and they're going, oh, we don't need you in your wheelchair. We don't have time for you guys. We have too much going on. And then she felt like when she was in the disability space, people were going, could you just not talk about the lesbian thing? We've got enough going on in our space, and being aware that we need to be inclusive across the board.
And the trouble is when we feel like we have to earn and fight for a piece of the inclusion pie, which doesn't exist, but many people think it does, it sets a hierarchy. So we know at the moment, the Black community and issues of disability within the Black community is in an entirely different space. And people who have a disability and are Black, are in a much worse position than someone like me who's white and middle class. But we create that environment where we feel like we can only have so much inclusion, and so we've got to prioritize who has it, and it's a really dangerous thing.
Yeah, nobody wins the Suffering Olympics, right? It's not a competition, and inclusion, I think, is really important. Danielle, I think that leads us perfectly on to our next question.
It does. So
you guys are so good anticipating our needs.
Yes, they are. So one a statistic that always shocks me, particularly in the legal industry, is that only 8% of lawyers self-identify, which seems unrealistically low. And it makes me wonder how many people we truly have with disabilities and not disclosing it. And so I would like to talk about disclosure and how we can reframe that as not something that we're exposing, a limit that we're exposing, but rather we're unlocking talent.
I'm happy to kind of start with that one. I think disclosure is complex because it intertwines both the relationship that we have with our own disability and how much that we feel is helpful in our environment to share, because the two don't always coincide. For example, I personally, I've done a lot of work on myself in therapy, and I think I'm at a good stage now to feel able to disclose. But sometimes, depending on the environment and how receptive that environment is, and whether you're not only going to be heard, but whether there's going to be kind of supportive action taken, brings in this dialogue internally as to how much do I share, how much is helpful to share, how much will be heard and acted upon, and how much do I need to self-preserve, like Daniel said, you know, previously on the intersectional element, kind of where's the line on kind of when you actually self-preserve, because people switch off and they can become like exhausted when you share. So ultimately it's about, for me anyway, and I can only speak for myself, it's about really navigating the situation in the environment. And I think you become very perceptive to the people that will actually hear you and will actually potentially make change. And that's where the allyship comes in. That's where we really need the allies that aren't just saying that they're allies, but they're actually acting and doing. And again, that feeds into the cultural systemic change. And I've had very differing experiences of disclosure depending on the environment. So I think that just goes to show that we have to start with the culture, and that is changed through people sharing their unique narrative, but that takes courage. That's my feelings on it.
Great. Claire, I know you have thoughts on monitoring, and I know there are people out there. This is one really big issue when you talk to people. People say, oh, we need to start laying the groundwork. We don't have anyone with a disability in our business. And we know that you have all kinds of people with disabilities in your business. They just haven't told you yet. So Claire, any other additional thoughts? Obviously, it's not obviously, but as Lily said, it's a culture issue. But do you have thoughts on some just top tips for people to push that disclosure and monitoring?
I think Lily's spot on. I think for me, there's three things. One is build trust and psychological safety before you ask, not after. The second is be honest with yourself about what you're going to do with it. You know, if you don't have an appetite in your organization to make changes, don't ask the question. But then when you do ask the question, tell people why you're asking them. Don't frame it in a I want to know things about you. Frame it in a I want to enable you to be your best, and therefore I don't need to know what condition you've got. I need to know what you need in order to thrive. A conversation you should be having with everybody, irrespective of disability. Yeah. But then when you get data, do something with it and communicate that back. You said, we did, and that will increase people's confidence.
And it's not a zero-sum game, it's an ongoing process. So the first time you ask these questions is your benchmark, and then you just want to go up from there. And you know, and engaging in those strategies that Claire and Lily just laid out, you will see improvements year on year, and that is also a sign of progress. And you'll see other great things kind of blossoming and flowing around that. And I know that's a big part of the work we've been doing at Reed Smith, is the fact that there is sustained work over time. That work is increasing, it's more visible. We have more and more visible role models, amazing people like Luke and Danielle and Vaibhav and all kinds of people you'll be hearing from today, and great leaders who will support it. So this also leads us really well into our last question. And then we have a couple questions in the Q&A box. If people want to ask questions, ask them in the Q&A box. We'll do those rapid fire. We've got 2 on deck. And our last topic, which we've referred to, is, you know, we've talked about intersectionality, which, you know, we borrow from the race space. Now we want to talk about allies, which really is a concept that developed in the LGBT plus space and now has been spread out to, I think, all strands. And I wanted to hear everyone on the panel's thoughts about allyship, and how do we encourage an open dialogue? How do we empower people to be better allies around disability and help create that better culture? Luke, do you want to start with that? And then we'll go on to Lily and Claire.
Sure, thanks, Daniel. I guess I would reflect that everyone on this video call either could potentially develop a disability in their lifetime, or may know somebody who needs support and understanding. I think, building off the point on culture and making it safe to disclose a moment ago, we need to focus our organizations' cultures both to be receptive to bringing people into them, and to making it safe to be counted and to ask for help. And those are, you know, 2 different things. I think there's people hiding in many law firms and social organizations, But I think there's also barriers to entry, and I think that's obvious. And we can all improve our organizations, everyone on this call, to make it easier, to be more open and accommodating, not just to get into the door, but to have an ongoing process of asking and to discussing how to make it easiest to thrive, and to focus on your own abilities. I found that my own experience with that has changed and been different throughout, every stage of my experience with epilepsy. Starting with some types of physical accommodations and then growing to other types, things that are not as easy as a floor mat or a rubber bumper on the desk, things that are things around hours, or around even how I do my self-evaluation, which is painful talking about comparisons of myself and others. And sometimes I just couldn't do it, and I asked not to. I think organizations can do a lot. And as it was said, if you don't want to hear the answer, it's tough to ask the question. And I think the culture needs to be appropriate in our organizations, and people need to talk about doing this. And you can't just expect it to happen overnight. I'll stop there.
Awesome. I think those are some great insights. And we're getting close to the end of time, but we have some great questions from the audience that we want to do rapid fire. We don't have a lot of time, so for the audience, we may keep them more brief than we will like to. We have some good questions that I'm sure we could talk on and on and on about. So the first question is, how do you feel that disabilities gained later in life are easier for colleagues to understand and comprehend than those that are born with a disability and have to prove themselves from day one and throughout their employment journey? Is there a different perception about their disability?
I think there's a different reaction to it as opposed to perception. I know when I had my accident, I already had a good reputation in my job, and therefore I think when people were thinking about how I could return to work, I already had value and I already had worth, and therefore people were much more open to thinking about how to make it work rather than the issues. I suspect if I had applied as a new person and talked about being a wheelchair user, it would be a different thing. When we know someone and we have a positive relationship with them, we respond to things in a more constructive way rather than a fear of what could happen.
That's great. Luke, anything you wanted to add, or Lily? Sorry.
No, don't worry. No, I was just going to say, I think mine's quite unique. Well, it's not such a unique experience, but in the sense that I don't know which category I would fall into, because I was 8 when I was diagnosed, when I acquired my disability. So it was at a time where it kind of, although I can remember pre-8, I still feel like a lot of the barriers that I experienced, in society and work, for example, and feeling like my skills and ability are really celebrated, that there have been challenges there. I would say that overall, I think the allyship is really important. And as far as kind of bringing in data and asking the questions across the whole organization, not just focusing on people with disabilities, but asking those difficult questions and getting feedback from the whole organization can really help bring to light the issues that might be present. And I think that's something that I feel if that's done and followed up on a regular basis from a HR perspective, then the kind of barriers to getting through the door in jobs should be reduced, or in time, hopefully, will be reduced.
Great. And I think the next question we have kind of flows on well from that. And I'm going to ask Luke to give an answer to this one, because I think it flows on well and it will be something he'll have lots of thoughts on. My partner is hearing impaired, and only when I realized how many places are not accessible for him and for people with disabilities in general. How do you think workplaces can be more inclusive and accessible to people with disabilities?
Oh, I guess you have to listen to your people, but I think there's a lot of organizations out there that have a lot of tips on this sort of thing, to help you review your practices, buildings, for those sorts of physical types of barriers that can be adjusted. I'm going to stop there. Other people might have more to say.
The only thing I'd add is we need to help people be curious and be safe to ask, which means that if they get it wrong, if they use the wrong language, we need to allow people to be clumsily human and learn from that and do better, rather than attack them because it's not perfect, because that just shuts down conversation.
Absolutely. And there's way too much of that on social media for any group, because I think it creates negativity, because people say, if someone does this to you, then you should feel this way. You should be angry. You should feel offended. You should go on the attack. And it's not a constructive environment, particularly not in a workplace. It's like, if someone gets it wrong, intent is really important. And as you said, Claire, creating that space for people to make mistakes, learn, and also people as allies can speak up if something goes wrong and point out perhaps to someone, and again, that confrontation or talking about an issue doesn't have to happen in the moment. Sometimes it's easier later on or after.
Yeah.
And so you can do that on someone's behalf as well.
Yeah, until shown otherwise, I'd like to presume good faith in those situations and hope people can change.
Most people are good people. Most people want to treat people with respect. Most people want to get stuff right. And that's why, that earlier conversation we had, I don't feel like, there's way too much focus on unconscious bias. Most of the bad stuff that goes on is bias, and we just really need to tackle the hard stuff and not give people outs, much like Claire said with the visible versus invisible. I see Vicky appearing, which means apologies to the two people who asked some great questions we're not going to have time to get to, but we will leave them there in the Q&A box to be inherited by our future panels. Yeah. Thank you so much to all our panelists. From Daniel and Danielle, we're both really grateful. We apologize we could not get an entire panel of people named along our theme, but we do love the fact that Claire, Lily, and Luke were able to join us and bring their expertise. And it's really an honor to speak alongside not one, but two Paralympians. So thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Claire. And thanks everyone for joining us. We are going to turn back over to Vicky. The fun's just getting started, guys.
Thanks, panel one. I'm going to move forward quickly to panel two, because I know we're already running a few minutes behind. Panel two is titled Employing People with Disabilities is Good for Business. This panel will discuss why it is beneficial to hire people with disabilities, how do we actively recruit and ensure diverse candidates are members of our workforces, and what businesses and organizations can do to normalize disability in the workforce and in our society. Our moderators today are Carolyn Pepper and Jonathan Andrews of Reed Smith. Carolyn is a partner of Reed Smith Entertainment and Media Group based in the firm's London office. Carolyn is the co-founder and current chair of Reed Smith's Business Inclusion Group Leaders, and Carolyn's also a member of Reed Smith's Mental Health Task Force. Jonathan Andrews is an associate in the firm's Global Entertainment and Media Industry Group, also based in our London office. He's a member of Leaders and a co-chair of the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network. Jonathan has been recognized on a national and international level for best practice in diversity and inclusion over several years, including most recently recognition from the Law Society Excellence Awards and an Oxford University Social Mobility Report in 2019 and the Franco-British Council in 2020. Jonathan is also one of the top 10 individuals on the Shaw Trust Power List. Panelist Srin Madapali, who I will introduce next, has also earned one of the 10 coveted spots on the Shaw Trust Power List. Our panelists today are Srin Madapali, Stuart Pixley, and Jane Burton, as well as Kevin Hara. Srin is an entrepreneur who co-founded Accomable in 2015, a travel platform for people with disabilities, which was acquired by Airbnb in November 2017. Srin is a real wheelchair user and co-founded Accomable to address personal frustrations finding accessible accommodation when traveling. Stuart has been a senior attorney at Microsoft for the last 12 years, and he is deeply involved in disability diversity in the legal field. He's a former leader and current member of the Washington Attorneys with Disabilities Association. He's the former president and founding board member of the National Association of Attorneys with Disabilities and a former commissioner of the ABA Commission on Disability Rights. Jane is a chair of Lawyers with Disabilities Division, or LDD, of the Law Society. She's also a member of the Law Society's Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. Jane is passionate about her work at LDD and her mission to show the advantages to firms of employing disabled lawyers and having diverse workforce that truly represents their client base. And last but not least, Kevin Hara is an associate in Reed Smith's Life Sciences and Health Industries Group, and he is based in our firm's San Francisco office. Kevin is another co-founder and board member of Leaders, and he's also a member of the firm's Asian American Diversity Inclusion Group. Thanks, panel two. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I just say, firstly, thank you to our fantastic panelists, Jane, Kevin, Stuart, and Srin, for all being here today. Also, thank you for everybody who's attending and watching this. And I think it just shows, even in the current circumstances where obviously we're not able to hold in-person meetings, actually on this International Day of Persons with Disabilities, you know, we've still been able to put on a great interactive international event from our own, in some cases from our own houses or wherever it is that you may be. And I think that you know, that really speaks to the point that a lot of the barriers that exist in disability are ones that can be overcome if a society just thinks about how to do that, which I think is probably a theme that may well come up in this and other talks today. I think I'll just sort of kick off really by addressing and asking the first question that we really want to talk about today, given our panel is particularly focused on the issue of employment. And so really I wanted to start off by asking, why do you think that hiring people with disabilities is good for business? Jane, do you want to perhaps answer this one?
Hi, Jonathan, and thank you for asking me today. Well, why? There's so much untapped talent out there, people in the workforce that have disabilities, but so many that don't. The unemployment rate amongst disabled people is really high, but they're very talented and educated people. So what do you get? You get loyal employees if you employ people with disability. Quite often, if you get the reasonable adjustments that you want in a firm, you don't want to go anywhere else. You want to stay where it's comfortable. You want to do well. You want to excel, work hard. You bring empathy with you because you've had to overcome many challenges as a disabled person every day. In fact, nearly every hour presents you with challenges that you have to overcome. You bring that to your work. You're a problem solver. So you're getting this incredible package when you employ a disabled person. We might have problems with our bodies, but there's nothing wrong with our brains. We've got, you know, we're educated people. We reflect also the general population. So not only are you showing to your firm, but to your clients that they're representing people like themselves. You also attract the purple pound and reflect people with money with disabilities, because not everybody is poor who has a disability. They're more likely to go and spend their money in a firm that employs disabled people. I think I probably could speak for about 10 minutes on this, if not longer. I maybe should let someone else speak.
No, it's definitely a big area, and of course it's the key focus of our talk today. And I just everything you said is definitely something that I agree with and resonates with me. Kevin, I was wondering your thoughts on this one.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's an honor to be here today. We've heard so many amazing panelists talk already. And, echoing what Vibe started off with early today, hiring people with disabilities, number one, it's the right thing to do. We should be doing it. And I'm fortunate to be in a place, Reed Smith, that takes those commitments seriously. And management has embraced disability diversity and other kinds of diversity as well. So we're very fortunate to practice at such an organization, but more organizations should do it. And it not just, as Luke mentioned, because the ADA requires people to have their reasonable accommodations, but because it is the right thing to do. But also attractive to organizations across the board is it's good for the bottom line. Jane mentioned that there is a huge section of the population that has a disability of one kind or another, whether it is visible or non-visible. I do not like to, use the term invisible, as Claire mentioned before, because, it can kind of gloss over that. But we have so many people who are part of this pipeline that we really need to include in the workforce. And in fact, there have been studies on this, notably by Accenture, who is one of the firms who has largely scored very high on the DEI index. The DEI index is a benchmarking tool used by Disability:IN to determine how well firms commit to disability diversity. And what the study found, in short, was that the companies who were the champions of disability diversity, the highest performers on the report, outperformed their peers in key areas such as net income, economic profit margins, revenue growth. And in seeing this, you can understand that while it's not only the right thing to do, it's good for the bottom line of the company. And I think as more organizations can look at these statistics, they can see the business case as well as the ethical case for including more persons with disability. We don't want to fall back on numbers and the bottom line, because really it's something that we need to focus on more. And there's so many ways that we can incorporate practices that allow people from day one, from recruitment throughout their tenure at a place until retirement, are supported and empowered.
Right, thanks very much, Kevin. Carolyn, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, thank you, Jane and Kevin, for sort of, talking a bit about all that untapped talent that is out there. One of the things that I often talk about, a subject close to my heart, is dyslexia. And we're often talking about how people with dyslexia span the entire span of intellectual abilities, just like everybody else does. And I think it's a key point to drive home that disability is the same. It's just the same as anybody else. With disability, it spans all types of ability and all types of skills. So, I think that's a really key point that I'd like to get across before I ask my question. So given all of that, Stuart, why do you think that people with disabilities and all of this talent is being overlooked by employers and in the workplace generally?
Yeah, so I think it's overlooked for all the reasons, frankly, that our first panel covered. First and foremost, right, it's assumptions, it's stereotypes, it's fear. It's, you're too much trouble, you're too expensive, you're too inefficient, and frankly, you just don't look like, or I don't think you look like what a doctor, lawyer, accountant should be. Second reason why I think folks are overlooked is sort of the flip side of that, which is because of that, I think invisible disabilities experience this tremendously, is it's about, stigma, it's about covering, it's about all the things we do, that reflect sort of the internalization of all of those same prejudices. And one of the things I want to emphasize is, this experience is really no different than what our brethren, as it were, in other diverse communities face. I think there's a couple of things I wanted to really call out, which is especially those of us in the law field, there's a lot of sort of institutional things which get in the way. For example, in the US, in order to become a member of the bar, there's also a character and fitness examination, and it often puts a burden on people that have an invisible disability to prove that they're stable enough to practice law. In other words, you're sort of presumed not to be fit unless you can prove otherwise. One of the other critical things about sort of this idea about being untapped is, we need to have institutions, like yours and like others and like Disability EN, but I think more domain specific, that fly our flag. And we need to start building really visible, communities of critical mass. I'm such a big believer in, not only affinity groups and things like that, but we need more minority bar associations and other things that, harness our power and our visibility. And so, I think that's part of it. I think it's super important that we start inserting ourselves, not just in the sort of usual stream of talking about, disability in the work, but disability is part of the regular framework of diversity, because it is such a powerful narrative and we fit in so well. We need to make sure that people understand that, it's not just, accommodating people so they can work. It's about building a vibrant, powerful, diverse workforce, and we're really a part of that.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I totally agree with that. I think visibility is so important, and developing a critical mass of organisations and talking more about it. The number of times we see a diversity list which doesn't include just disability makes my eyes water when I see it. It really frustrates me. So thank you for raising that. Sven, what are your thoughts on that question as to why why do you think employers are kind of overlooking people with disabilities?
I think just sort of to echo Stuart there, I think you give a pretty comprehensive list of I think all the various reasons out there, and don't want to restate those. But I think the only one I would add is maybe going one level further below. Sort of you've got all the reasons that you can attribute to just being unaware of the opportunity, but maybe also looking further deep into this, into some of the institutional disadvantages that often disabled people face from much earlier on in life. So how do we think about making sure that disabled people are having access to the right educational opportunities, can go to the institutions that they can learn the skills, whether you want to work in a big law firm or a consulting firm or tech firm or goodness knows what. And I think it's another really big conversation to have about how do we help even just up level people and get them and help invest in people to have the skills that are so fundamental to some of these roles in the first place. So I do think it's a parallel track where employers can do so much more to better tap into this pool of talent and opportunity, but also, yes, how do we invest in people from a much younger and earlier stage and reduce those barriers to be in a position to apply to these opportunities in the first place?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the barriers start pretty young, actually, and I think a lot needs to change in terms of the education setting and the skills that are being taught and tested at an early age, which rule people out when they don't need to. Something I feel very strongly about. So you've given, I've got another question on that in a minute, but you've enabled me to get onto my pet subject there for a minute. So thank you for that, Jonathan. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. And I just say, a lot of those points are definitely things I would recognise. I think as well, can you speak about your experience of how people see dyslexia? And I think similarly, I think with autism, people can often think about the issues with hiring somebody and overlooking because they think, oh, well, they wouldn't fit in, or they wouldn't be, they haven't got the skills, because there's obviously they can't, they can't do anything to the same level as anybody else because they're disabled. And actually seeing the fact that there are these variants, as you said, in terms of ability, in terms of access, and in terms of skills, as anybody has, but it's just about making sure that people are able to be tapped and having that strength, and it's finding a way of utilising that strength. And I think that's sort of a mindset that need to sort of look towards. And so kind of on a similar vein, looking at actually how to recruit individuals with disabilities. And there are sort of different schemes that are out there, but there are many sort of different ideas on these and how they might work. And so I just really wanted to ask some of the panel, how can we actively recruit people with disabilities? And Jane, if you wanted to come in on this.
Thank you. I don't know if everybody out there has read or heard about it, but there was a report that was launched in January this year by Legally Disabled. I know Professor Foster and Debbie is on the next panel, or one later on today, and it showed in the survey results that only 9% of disabled people were getting through legal recruiters to get to actually the the interview stage. So make sure the recruiters that you're using, because I know a lot of big firms use recruiters, make sure they're getting the talent, the disabled people. They're being actively filtered out. We have many examples of people who are members of LDD who come to us, then they apply, mention a disability, and they're not getting through. So that's a really big issue. If only 9% of people are happy, disabled people are happy with that process, use specialist recruiters who are recruiting disabled students and employees. Use them if that's a better way of doing things. Make sure that your application process is not filtering out disabled people by having a dedicated person to deal with recruitment of disabled people, so that they're not feeling that they're going to be a nuisance by asking for reasonable adjustments. Because I know there's a big fear. I have it too, or had it, maybe not so much now. But what am I going to tell them about this gap in my CV? Because I was in hospital and I missed so much education at that point, so my CV doesn't look normal. Ask people about mitigation. There's many things that we can be doing to just ensure that people are getting through. Also, offer part-time positions, part-time training contracts, because I know an awful lot of disabled people would really like to train and can't do so because they can't manage to work full-time. They will give their all as a part-time employee. And this is something that the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the legal regulator here in the UK, they're very pro part-time training contracts. They don't have an issue with them, but law firms seem to have an issue with them. They're really rare.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that sense of, finding ways to help utilize people's strengths and their talents in a part-time training contract, or different job descriptions, and that it's a way of thinking about it. And often it can be, this person doesn't fit how we want to do things, rather than how can we actually make sure we get the best out of everybody. And I think it's that mindset thing, really.
I know a lot of testing made it very difficult for certain disabilities to get through the application process, and I think a lot of
metric testing,
they're dropping the testing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
very good points. Kevin, I wondered if you had any thoughts on this one at all.
Thank you. Jane made some excellent points, and one of them I'd like to echo is the fact that there are not a lot of people, not enough persons with disability in the pipeline, because of the way our systems are set up in secondary, for instance, in the legal field, in secondary education, law school, there are drop-offs at every level of persons with disabilities in those institutions. So in colleges, and then when you get to law school, then you have a lower percentage of persons with disability. And by the time we are looking at recruiting them at law firms or other legal organizations, we've already, called out some very talented people unwittingly because the system is geared against persons with disability. So we have to, look at a broad-based approach. We have to have a more community-based outreach, as Stuart was saying. We have to have more organizations who are doing these things, bar associations and other organizations, so that people can see, persons with disabilities can see, oh, this is a career that maybe I can, excel in. This may be appealing to me. There are persons like me in these fields. So we need to make it obvious. And second, our recruitment process itself has to be accessible. And by accessible, I mean we need our recruiters to be trained. We need our application process to be accessible, whether it is a person with a visual disability who needs a different kind of application, or perhaps is hearing impaired, or has another kind of disability, that so that they can even apply. And it's important to consider those issues at the earliest possible stage, because otherwise you're already excluding very talented people, and you've already lost people before they even get to the door. And then once they do get to the door, have the recruiters who are working on interviews and reading resumes, have them trained to issues of disability diversity. In other words, the words you use matter. Disability etiquette does matter. I understand we want to be forgiving and give people the benefit of the doubt, but in a recruiting situation, we don't want people using the wrong terminology, and we want them to convey a sense that we want people at our organization, we want to show that we are genuinely interested in them, and not just as a statistic, not just to increase diversity, but to provide meaningful employment that empowers people and engages them and allows them to really become their best selves, to add value to the organization, and to show what they can do, because people really just need a chance. So we need to be able to give them that chance, and our recruiters need to be aware of these issues. And I think this is something that organizations have done better at, but we can certainly improve. And the broad-based approach I was talking about, the making sure that at the secondary education, at the law school level, that there are more individuals with disabilities available in those arenas, because it's really about a broad systemic change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of leading on to that actually is our next question, because having people in at all levels requires that pipeline of individuals to plan to be in place. And so what I really wanted to ask Srin was, how do you think we can ensure that there's a pipeline of individuals from which we can recruit?
I think it's got to be a multifaceted approach. So for me, like, ideally just to at least get the wheel turning. Like if there are, hopefully one day in different industries, whether it be tech or law or whatever, sort of collective scholarship programs, could sort of the industry pull together to make those investments in people, potentially fast track people through into certain schools, and have access to opportunities that may not have normally been available were it not for scholarship type support. So sort of that's one bucket. I think you probably then also need sort of industry kind of support and lobbying to government and sort of local and regional educational authorities to make those investments needed to help young disabled people be equipped with the skills that are needed to go to the next level. And I mean, none of these are quick fix solutions, right? It's not going to be a, you know, click my fingers tomorrow, it's all going to be fixed. Like these are long-term infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean like social, educational, cultural infrastructure that needs investing in. But you know, I feel like some of these things could at least get the momentum going, at least get things started.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and completely agree. Stuart, did you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, I mean, as far as pipeline is concerned, you know, we do have to keep on pressing to make sure our education is both accessible and inclusive, all the things we've been talking about, and that we, you know, have all the right, high expectations of everyone, that they can really succeed and excel. It's going to be really important that at every step along the way, we need to have and invest in our role models, our mentors, and our champions, and those are different things, and we need to be paying attention to this. And you know, one of the things that occurred to me is that, you know, we're not just looking for, you know, people with disabilities to mentor others, which of course we do need, but you know, that can come from so many different places. And you know, I think we need to spend time, you know, with, you know, outreach and sort of inspire and interest folks in all sorts of different careers. You know, I feel like, you know, a lot of folks with disabilities, in my experience, you know, default to doing a lot of, you know, careers in disability law or disability advocacy. Absolutely, we need talented people doing that, but we need people doing all other sorts of things as well. And there's so many different options, and we need to have folks thinking about, other cool ways that we can go. Otherwise, we're going to create kind of a, a disability ghetto, as it were. And, you know, I'm really struck by, Jane was talking about, 9% folks not getting through. And, it just seemed like really a basic thing to say, but we just need to say with the, loudest, most clear voice possible to recruiters and to the population, we want to employ people with disabilities. We value these folks. It's important to us, and it's a mission for you as recruiters to do this. So, I mean, to the extent that people are in the pipeline and not getting through, we have to show that that pipeline is open and not bottlenecked. I think at some level, we're going to have to make some real investments, in developing our pools and developing these sorts of things. Because, even if we have folks looking for people with disabilities, oftentimes it's hard to say, fill a given requisition if you don't have sort of your established pool that you draw from. You need to start building that stuff up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Stuart. And I think that point as well you make about, not everybody having to be disability experts, but working in different areas of laws or different roles is something I, completely have experience of, because I do a lot around disability advocacy, but I also, my main job is as a, entertainment media lawyer, and I would want to practice that because I enjoy it. I wouldn't want to be sort of hamstrung or pushed down one lane because I happen to be autistic. I want to be open to whatever you're strong at. So definitely completely agree with that. Carolyn, did you have any thoughts at all?
Well, I was going to just get in on the next question, which kind of leads in from some of what Stuart was saying there, and that is about the kind of filtering points where people are being filtered out. And thank you to the person in the chat who also asked a question about being filtered out during recruitment processes. whether that be at Reed Smith or any other law firm, etc., because of the requirements to have traditional law firm qualifications. And I think that really drives back to, and I think all law firms and all organisations can look at their recruitment processes, and that includes us, to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible. In some respects, we have done that, but I know we could continue to improve on that, absolutely, and it's something we should continue to look at. But I think just talking about the various stages where people are finding that they are being filtered out, so to speak. I mean, there's primary and secondary education, there's university and college, and employment. Kevin, do you have any thoughts as to what we should be doing at each of those levels in order to stop these people being filtered out? And before you answer the question, Kevin, just I was very interested in, well, I was struck by what Stuart was saying, because I was reading a report recently from an answer from a government minister about why an exam accommodation wasn't especially available. And the answer was employers don't want people who can't do this, who can't spell, or whatever the issue was. And so I think I agree with you, Stuart, that the answer to the education questions to an extent are the employers have got to say what they do want, and we don't want people to be filtered out, and these are the skills we're looking for. But I digress. So Kevin, what do you think about these filter points? What do you think should be done in relation to each one of them?
Thank you, Carolyn. That's an excellent question. And of course, there's no easy answer to this. And as Srin alluded to, it's not something that can happen overnight, but we need to be thinking about at a young age, making sure that people with disability of all types are supported. In other words, if they need adjustments or accommodations, that they have those from the beginning of their school, so that they don't feel discouraged and they feel like, oh, I can do this. You know, I can be anything. And we need to have communities aware, as Stuart said, not just, you know, because you have a disability, you must practice disability law or go into disability advocacy or something necessarily related to that disability, that there are a whole world of careers open to them. So we need young people to understand that, and mentorship is a key to that. Having allies and mentors who are working with these institutions is a very important part of the process. You know, and also having organizations who are, you know, disability affinity organizations, or, you know, such as like a law society that is specific to persons with disability. We see a lot of those, but not enough at law schools. And those can also support people because they allow people to have a platform to really use their voices, and to work with others, and to work with the institution to see what we can do to improve our school, and what we can do to include more people here, and not just include people, but engage them, like really allow them to be part of the decision-making process of what goes into the important aspects of the school, and same for law school, because all of these are places where, you know, we've heard that there are bottlenecks, and so community support is key. Having available accommodations and adjustments, having administration aware that they need to be keen on these issues is necessary, and also allowing people to form some type of affinity group, or something where they can have a platform to further the cause. And having businesses and organizations actively mentor students, you know, act in seeking to work with them throughout their time in school is another way to do this, because they can see, I can take this route that I never thought was possible, because the organization is interested in me, the school is supporting me, my classmates, are interacting with me in ways that maybe that they didn't think were possible.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thank you for sharing that. That's very, very insightful. Thank you. Jane, you used to be a teacher, so I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this.
I certainly have, yeah. I know when I was a teacher, disabled pupils will come up to me, you're disabled, aren't you, miss? And I was like, yeah. And so you can do whatever you want, absolutely. I think somebody told me in my career service I could never be a teacher, so I think I just did that to show them that you could. I think in the UK, the 25% of students at university declare a disability, but only 3% of lawyers do. And we feel, I think, LDD, and what I think was shown in the legally disabled, was that it's the bottleneck is at the training contract stage and getting qualified, because it's very expensive. The Law Society has a scheme called the Diversity Access Scheme, which will pay for the course to do. I got a Diversity Access Scheme bursary when it first started out, and that helped. Otherwise, I couldn't have changed career to go towards law. So I think I feel that people are getting through to university level. We get a lot of people who are just stuck once they've got their GDL, their law degree, their masters in law, or the LPC. And the problem is getting through into training contracts. One of the things we feel is we have an LDD scheme, work experience scheme, that we've run for about 3 or 4 years. Didn't run this year because of the COVID situation, but we really hope that we don't have to run this scheme, and that firms will just run their own and dedicate some training contract spaces and work experience places for disabled applicants, because currently that's where the bottleneck is, I think, in this country.
Yeah, comes down to the employers and the firms.
Yeah, and the recruiters, back to the recruiters. Yeah.
Which I think
of taking on people with disabilities for some reason. They're not so frightening.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I think that leads neatly into the next question that Jonathan was going to ask.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Helen. So, the next question was actually how do we ensure that recruitment agencies, although it's making the hiring decisions, actively seek out diverse candidates? So it does lead very well on. And Jane, as you've already sort of spoken a lot about this area, and your great insight within that, wondering what you thought about that particular point.
I think we've got to remain vocal. I know certainly members of the LDD committee, who are senior partners in firms, have spoken to their firms and said, why are more disabled people not coming through? We want you to push more people through to us. The president of the Law Society, the past president, Simon Davis, had a dinner just before lockdown, which was such a long time ago now, where he invited all the Magic Circle firms, senior partners, to talk about what on earth was going on. That the report that was before them was shocking. The legally disabled research showed such an awful experience with disabled solicitors and trainees in this country, and that they needed to address that. We've just got to remain vocal.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree, and keep pushing. And I'd be interested to hear about other sort of planners' perspective, and particularly Srin. I was wondering what your kind of perspective was on this one.
sorry, started talking with mute on. Again, like I totally agree with Jane. Like, you know, it's definitely things that sort of need to be done, and you know, it's sort of interesting hearing because it has been a while since, you know, I did apply for training contracts, and you know, did my 4 years at Herbert Smith, or Freehills, or Herbert Smith as it was known then. I think the one bit I do sort of reflect on it, there's an old saying, and I think Charlie Munger quotes it a lot, is sort of tell me the incentive, tell me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And I think if you are looking for recruitment to be better, like we do need to think about what incentive structures are. Like in a lot of industries, law included, the entire HR recruitment industry is incentivized to fill roles as quickly as possible, and fill the roles often pretty defensively. And so if you're asking people to recruit outside of regular pools, I mean, there's also got to be the right incentives to do that as well, right? Because like, if you are asking people to go and do something a little bit different, you've got to try and take that fear factor out of it. So, you know, I do think that we do need to have a rethink about how we incentivize like process within the recruitment and HR industry, by and large.
Yeah, no, I can completely agree with that. And just making sure that, you know, that flows through in all levels, I think. Stuart, as well, I think, you know, in your position, you'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
I mean, I guess, you know, one thing I'd add, I mean, you know, first of all, it's really striking when you listen to what we just heard. It's clear that we have just a last mile problem, right? Talented people are coming up through education, but they're not being able to get to, you know, training contracts, as you call it, that sort of critical last mile thing. That says a lot about the fact that it's less about lack of talent and, you know, so much more about, you know, fear and all the other things. So, you know, check that. You know, I'm super impressed by what, you know, Trent said about, you know, providing the right incentives. One of the things that's controversial, but I think we need to investigate, are things like slating requirements, right? So in, you know, diversity hiring, a lot of times folks are able to say, you know, in order to proceed with, you know, an interview thing, I need you to have a diverse slate. And everyone knows what that means with respect to, you know, race and gender and things like that. Disability has traditionally not been counted in that. That to me creates exactly the wrong set of incentives, right? You know, all of the fear is allowed to you know, to have, you know, free sway. And there's nothing that is sort of overcoming that with an incentive other than, and we should do this, you know, create the right positive narrative, et cetera, and say that we want it. We need, you know, like I said, we need to do more to show that we mean it. And so anyway, that's just one example of something we could do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, as you say, about those diverse slates and making sure that all candidates, including disability, are captured, because otherwise you could get a great candidate who has disability, doesn't fit into any other diversity characteristics, but their disability has, you know, and the way society treat them around disability has prevented them from getting into certain roles, but you still wouldn't be able to use them to fulfill any slate, and so therefore there's almost incentive against sort of taking them on. So it's actually making sure that disability and, you know, other identities are kind of included in that. Yep. Yeah, so yeah, that's just great point. Carolyn, did you want to come in?
Well, I've got so many more questions to ask and so few minutes to ask them in. So I'm going to just squeeze in a couple of the big questions. And there's Vicky, which is the sign that I've got to stop soon. I think I will just ask Stuart, how do you reconcile the lifestyle and the legal profession with medical difficulties, do you think?
Well, you know, I think there are two things. One is, you know, I think someone sort of said it really well with the, you know, plants and soil thing. It's, you know, you know, it's not that I have, you know, medical difficulties. It's that, you know, the world is not sort of, you know, opening and accommodating to me. But one of the things that's cool about law, I mean, you know, is that there are so many different ways to practice it. And I think not enough students are thinking about, that not only should they absolutely be following what interests them and what motivates them, but different practices have different cadences, have different designs, have different demands, and those can absolutely, accommodate, your disability and play to your strength. And an M&A lifestyle may be, working 24/7 for a number of weeks or months, and then you get a break. Other practices are more constant, but just require constant tending of smaller things. A lot of different ways to sort of figure out what work for you and your schedule. And the diversity of our profession is just infinite. And especially now that we're learning to use technology in ways we haven't before, it's just absolutely a thing that we can do.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stuart. I think that's definitely right. And then I'm going to ask the last question. Vicky will just let me squeeze it in before she reappears. Srin, I'll ask that of you, Srin. First of all, how can big companies, do you think, come together to invest in the normalization of disability within society, do you think?
I think a couple of ways. I think firstly, like the champions within different organizations and different industries do have to come together, and I hope sort of Reed Smith speaks to counterparts at other law firms, and those individuals are able to form relationships with their peers in other industries and can kind of like team up together a little bit to make those investments. I think the second piece probably is more on like the community side, the disability side, and we just really have to make sure that like that accountability is there, and all the various sort of pressure groups that we are a part of are constantly banging the drum, right? Like, and we're making sure that these issues aren't forgotten about.
Yeah, thank you, Srin. It's really good points.
If I could just add, I mean, obviously, the magnifying, effect of multiple folks saying the same thing makes a big difference. The other thing, talking about, being a representative of a large, company. Holy cow, the impact we can have through the reach that we have with media and stuff like that. I mean, Microsoft has invested a lot, including people with disabilities in its ad campaigns and things like that. And some of you in the States may have seen our, Super Bowl ads and so on and so forth. We have an outsized ability to change what, literally what disability culture looks like to a wide variety of people. That can have so much of a knock-on effect. We need to keep on pressing our companies to do more of that.
I totally agree. And Jane, can I let you have the last word on that?
I'll be very quick. I mean, we're constantly running round tables to educate law firms who we've discovered really don't know where to start. So, and they're asking very fundamental questions, which we're answering because it was the last ism, the last diversity strand to be addressed, and they don't know where to start from. I know that you, Carolyn, yourself have spoken at things that we've organised, and it's been very enlightening for people to see that it can work and does work, and there is no awful thing that will happen to you if you employ disabled people. So we're doing that. We've also produced, which is going to be issued in the next couple of weeks, is an easy wins document, which has come out of the recommendations from the legally disabled research to help law firms change their culture and way of working and start the recruitment of disabled people into law firms.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you so much to all of our panelists here. It's been really brilliant. Some really insightful and thoughtful comments there. I'm going away feeling definitely motivated to do more. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry to those people who put questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry. Vicky's here, and therefore I need to be quiet. But thank you very much, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Sharon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, panel 2.
Thank you.
Sorry to be the bad guy, but we're excited to move forward to panel 3, titled Modern Workplace and Disability in the COVID-19 Environment. This panel will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on people with disabilities, the obstacles people with disabilities come across when trying to find work, and the lessons learned from this year's unique circumstances when it comes to disabled employees moving forward. Our moderators for panel 3 are Richard Sini and Kristen Snyderman of Reed Smith, and our panelists are Elizabeth Rimmer, Dr. Debbie Foster, and Vibhu Sharma. Richard is a partner in Reed Smith's Energy and Natural Resources Group, specializing in transactional construction projects. He is based in our London office, is an active member of leaders in the mental health task force at the firm, and he has autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. Kristen Snyderman is the Senior Human Resource Manager in our New York office. She serves in a leadership capacity for the Wellness Works initiative, which is focused on improving the overall well-being of attorneys and professional staff at the firm. And Kristen is also serving as in a core leadership role of Reed Smith's mental health task force, whose goal is to reduce the stigma surrounding mental health issues at the firm and in the legal industry, as well as ensure mental health resources are available and being utilized by Reed Smith's employees. Our first panelist, Elizabeth Reamer, is the CEO of Law Care. She's been managing and developing charities in the mental health sector for over 20 years. And Law Care is an independent charity offering emotional support, information, and training to the legal community in the UK and in Ireland. Welcome, Elizabeth. Dr. Debbie Foster is a professor of employment relations and diversity at Cardiff Business School, Cardiff University. She's led the first major research project of its kind in the UK into the career experiences of disabled people in the profession. The project, is entitled Legally Disabled, the Career Experiences of Disabled People Working in the Legal Profession, which was undertaken in partnership with the Lawyers with Disabilities Division of the Law Society of England and Wales. Most recently, Debbie has co-produced a follow-up to the project in partnership with the Law Society to evaluate in particular the effects of COVID-19 on working practices of disabled people in the law. Vibhu Sharma is a passionate disability advocate working as a disability and inclusion research consultant with Their World, co-chairing the Global Partnership for Children with Disabilities Youth Council, and serving as a global board member of Generation Unlimited. She is a mentor for youth with and without disabilities at national and global levels and has been recognized as a Legends honoree by Partners for Youth with Disabilities USA for her mentoring active initiatives. Thanks so much, panel 3. Look forward to hearing from you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Unfortunately, we don't yet have Professor Foster, so we're hoping that she will be able to join us shortly. But in the meantime, you have us. Before I start, it's something that we've discussed before already, but I'm conscious we have a transatlantic panel. And we have a transatlantic audience. Wanted to note there are differences between the way the UK and the US treat terminology, and particularly about whether it's better to refer to disabled people, which is the preferred UK approach, or people with disabilities, which is the preferred approach in the US. I suspect we will hear both terms used within this chat. Everyone wanted me to stress that no offence is intended through the use of either term. It's complicated if you have to caveat every time you say it, and hopefully it will all flow properly. So we're here today to talk about modern workplace and disability in a COVID-19 environment. So this year has been an unprecedented situation across the world, which has forced upon us significant changes in the way that we work, study, live, interact with each other. It's had impacts on pretty much everyone, including on disabled people. So the intention of this panel is to explore some of those impacts and to see what lessons can be learned from this giant global social experiment, which may be important both during the ongoing pandemic situation and after it's gone, particularly if we move into a new normal, which differs from the position we had before. Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you the first question, which is through Law Care. I mean, there's been many comments about the impact of COVID on mental health. What's been Law Care's experience? Have you seen any deviations in the number of callers? Have any themes emerged?
Well, so at LawCare, we run a telephone helpline for anybody working in the legal sector to get in touch with us if they need to talk to somebody about something that's concerning them. It may be personal, it may be work related, it might be about their mental health. Predominantly it is about mental health. And so we had our first call with a COVID element to it on March the 10th. And what we've seen since then is about 40% of the support contacts that now come to LawCare have a COVID-related element to them. And we've actually seen that change over time, not surprisingly, as we've adapted more to living during a global pandemic. So at the beginning of COVID, just as we went into lockdown in the UK, which I think was the 23rd of March, we were getting lots of those calls around, we're not allowed to go into the office because the government edict was such, everyone should work from home if they could, but from individuals feeling very pressured by their legal employers to come into work, even though that was against government advice. So there was a lot of calls around that, and the initial, the sort of digital transformation that everyone had to go through, organizations and individuals overnight, to adapting to working to new ways. But what we've seen now, and it's interesting, is actually the number one reason people are getting in touch with us is they are seeing a deterioration in their mental health, if they've had existing mental health conditions or they're generally just finding this tough. And then the second most common sort of group, if you want to look at themes, is around working from home. And working from home has lots of great benefits, but it's also challenging for many of us because, you know, we're so used to that, the social support that we get in the workplace. A lot of that's very informal. The chat by the photocopier, if you still have those, the chat when you're making a cup of tea or coffee, bumping into someone in the lift on the way in, talking about the football last night, what you watched on Netflix, that sort of chat that takes place, and those sort of micro interactions that we have on a daily basis. So the social isolation that many people feel, they miss being at work with their colleagues, particularly if you live on your own. So there's been quite a lot around that. And also a sense of feeling overwhelmed by work. We've certainly picked up from callers to our helpline, people working in firms and legal practices where other colleagues have been furloughed, and they've had to pick up some of that additional work. And then I think also aligned with that, perhaps we all feel like this at times, that we're sort of existing in an era, if you've seen the image of Dali's melting clock, that clock on the side of a desk that's just sort of stretching out, that the day sort of feels a bit like that, because there isn't really a beginning and an end if you're working from home. We don't have the rituals of leaving our homes to get into the office. And we don't have the rituals of packing up, logging off, rushing for a train or whatever it is. So the day can extend, and what's happening is we fill that time that we got back at the beginning of not having to commute, we're now just filling that with more work. And so there is a concern that we have that we may be seeing higher levels of burnout and people feeling very overwhelmed and burdened by what they're experiencing at the moment. So those are the sorts of calls that have been coming through to us. And I don't think any of that would be surprising. I think we see every day in the national media, I'm sure it's the same in the US as it is in the UK, lots of stories around mental health and the impact that COVID is having on each of us, both in our personal lives and in our working lives.
Hi, I'm unmuted now. Sorry about that. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Next, we'll take it over to Vibhu, and we'd like to ask, what do you feel are the obstacles and barriers people with disabilities come across when they're trying to find work, and also when they're in work, and how may these have been impacted by COVID in your estimation?
Thank you for asking that question, because I think it is one of the most essential questions we need to be looking for a response to if we indeed wanted to not just create and achieve, but also sustain disability inclusive workplaces. So first and foremost, I think the biggest challenge that persons with disabilities face, or that I being a person with disability has faced, is that employers simply do not want to hire persons with disabilities. Why? Because there are myths around it. Employers think that people with disabilities are going to be a liability for the organization rather than them being an asset, or that they would not perform the job to the same standard as a non-disabled employee. And all these things are, all these myths are really the factors that undermine the opportunities that people with disabilities can have. Moreover, employers might also assume, and they do assume, that they will have to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities, and the cost of the reasonable accommodation would be too high, which is again a myth, because we have ample amount of research which has proven that most of the reasonable accommodations, or about 80% of the reasonable accommodations, cost less than $500. And a majority of them might not cost anything at all. Simple accommodations like allowing people to work remotely, flex working hours. They just don't cost anything. The other challenge is, again, what I was also hearing from the previous panel was the recruitment process. And how are we advertising our jobs? If we always advertise our jobs in formats that are not accessible to people with disabilities, it's very likely that people with disabilities won't even be able to apply to those jobs, because they would never know that there was a vacancy. And then if hired, then there are other challenges that people with disabilities might face, which are around social isolation while they are in employment. And that would happen because maybe their colleagues do not interact with them in the same way that they do with their non-disabled colleagues. The other reason, which is often a stressor for people with disabilities, is organizations using inaccessible technologies. So for example, I remember when I started working with Dear World, I started as a remote, in a remote position. And the first team call that I was invited to was on Blue Jeans, and I could not access it. I'm a screen reader user. The platform simply does not work with screen readers. I could not attend the call even for a second. And then I got in touch with my manager and I told him, look, this is what the issue is. We need to do something about it. It's been 2 years since then. We have stopped using Blue Jeans. We have not had a single call on Blue Jeans since that day. We transitioned to Zoom. But definitely it would have been a stressor for me, and so would it be for any person with a disability who cannot use the technology that a majority of the office space is using. So we need to ensure that we are indeed using accessible technologies. And yes, the coronavirus pandemic did amplify some of these challenges. So for example, many people lost jobs, we know that, but then people with disabilities, although there are no statistics, but it can be estimated that they would have been the first ones to lose a job because organizations were already assuming that they were a liability for them. Moreover, if you were a beginner or a fresher looking for a job, then it means even lesser opportunities for you, because a lot of the organizations have stopped their internship or career building programs. Then social isolation has been amplified for people with disabilities because as it has had less social network. And now, because of the need of social distancing, or if I put it correctly, physical distancing that the pandemic has introduced, has increased the social isolation that people with disabilities face. And now with a lot of organizations, or like with all the organizations having transitioned to remote working, they obviously have adopted newer technologies. And if in the process they had adopted inaccessible technologies, then obviously people with disabilities can't access them. I'll stop there. Sorry, I think I spoke too much.
No, not at all. And it's fascinating. Thank you. Professor Foster, so I mean, you've been carrying out research on behalf of the UK Law Society separately for the Welsh Government on the impact of COVID on disabled people. I'm not going to ask you to present your research, but no. Can you please tell us some common themes?
Yes, yeah. The first research project that we did back in August was with the Law Society and the Lawyers with Disabilities Division of the Law Society. And it was a survey that 108 disabled lawyers responded to. And I think some of the things we wanted to capture was that our previous research had suggested that the legal profession was very averse to giving home working and remote working as a reasonable adjustment. And that there was strong sort of traditions of presenteeism, being in the office, being seen to be working, of supervision, quite tight supervision, some necessary because people are training and they need that kind of support. But some disabled people did report being over supervised and not trusted very much in the workplace. So we thought that in a way, this was like an enormous social experiment, simply because you could never have created a social experiment where everybody worked from home. Had we just surveyed people who were disabled people, predominantly home working, I think we would have got different results. But the fact that we were all home working was a unique situation. And what we found was that something like 65% of people who were home working, who were disabled, said that their experience had been positive, particularly having a positive impact on their physical health. And this was things like they could pace and plan their work, they could take breaks. Some people felt that they could move around, which they couldn't do in the office, which if you've got a physical impairment, that can be really, really helpful. You could go out for a walk and get fresh air and not be judged for doing that. You could, you know, break your day up and you had control over your work in a way that you hadn't before. Some people also commented that they had colleagues who they felt judged them. And when they were working on their own, there were benefits to that in that they had some control over which colleagues that they contacted, and they weren't having people observing them and supervising them all the time or over supervising them. So there were positive benefits. And there were some negative benefits, as already mentioned, things like loneliness, isolation. There were differences in terms of what kind of impairment that you had. So some people said, well, you know, I find the whole experience of communicating with people remotely really, really difficult. And what we found in both the sets of research is there are differences in experience. So people who are visually impaired, for example, found going out in public during this pandemic really difficult because they can't socially distance. You know, it's just a really, really simple fact of being able to participate in public life, being able to socially distance. And people with hearing impairments saying that, you know, when they're out in public, that's impossible for them to lip read because people don't wear masks that allow them to lip read, for example. So we're immediately during the pandemic introducing a whole set of behavioural and public codes that are excluding certain disabled people from participating in society. So actually those people have often said that communicating through a screen has actually been liberating because they can attend the meetings without having to travel on the tube into London if they're working in a big city. Then they're not exhausted when they arrive at work, because they're not having to negotiate a society that is ableist and doesn't facilitate them as wheelchair users or visually impaired people. And you know, their start of the day is actually much better. We did some round tables to follow up from the survey to try and see whether some of the more positive aspects of our survey were still being maintained on since August. And the round tables seem to confirm most of the findings. People who had already had mental health difficulties found that these impacted on them even more when they were lonely or isolated. And there's also that contextual feeling. If you're remote, you're living somewhere remote, or you're in a shared household and you can't have private space to work in, or there's a lot of noise, or you've got caring responsibilities, or there's other things going on in the household, obviously those social factors are going to impact on your whole experience of remote working. And I think the Welsh Government report that I've been working on with disabled people's organisations in Wales has shown that socioeconomic disadvantage, a bit like ethnicity, you know, that the whole thing that's been revealed by COVID-19 is that it's actually not just a medical crisis. This is a social crisis that's been unfolding before our eyes. And it's about underinvestment in health services, underinvestment in support services for disabled people. So many disabled people have just been abandoned in the communities because there wasn't enough PPE for people to come into their homes and help them and support them. And, you know, it really has depended on income levels. In the UK, we've had something called the Coronavirus Act, which actually allowed local authorities to no longer have the sorts of responsibilities they had to provide services to disabled people. And disabled people weren't consulted and are not part of emergency planning in most governments in most countries, despite the UN saying that they should be part of all emergency planning decision making. And I think it's really important that we think in the future, how do we visualize this future post-COVID? How do we incorporate the positive benefits that have come from things like remote home working for disabled people, but also look at the negatives, but also think about clients and public spaces. You know, if we're going to go on in even a post-COVID world, we may still need social distancing. We may still need face masks. We may still need to communicate by remote technology that will not always be accessible to everyone. And we're going to have to think about developing codes of practice, new codes of practice that make accessibility a lot easier for everybody, I think.
That's a great, that brings us into the next question really well, which is what lessons, and maybe we can do kind of a round robin if Richard's okay with that, about the what lessons should employers learn or can they take away from this year's experiences when it comes to disabled employees and applying them going forward? If you had 3 things that you, pointers or tips that you would list, what would they be, panelists? Why don't we start with Vivo?
I think the biggest lesson that any employer should learn is on the cost of reasonable accommodation. So prior to the pandemic, employers thinking that reasonable accommodations are going to be very expensive, I think they need to realize that they might not be that expensive. It is a simple accommodation like telecommuting, then everybody has been telecommuting since the pandemic began. And people with disabilities would be telecommuting as well, and it should not be a problem as opposed to earlier when it was seen as a problem. I think, and then at the same time, employers need to understand that the technologies that they use really need to be accessible. And this is going to go on even after we have a vaccine, even after we begin, even after we begin to believe that the pandemic is over, as Dr. Foster was saying, we are going to be needing to use remote working and communicating through remote technology. So we do actually need to ensure that the technologies that we use are accessible. And again, I would go back to my own organization. So we have recently started transitioning to Office 365 at their Walden GBC. And I had this email and a call with my manager asking me, is Office 365 accessible to you? Because obviously I'm a screen reader user and we invest money in it, everybody transitions to it, and I feel left out because I'm not able to use the technology, then we lose the purpose. So I think A is to understand that, well, reasonable accommodations could be required by anyone, irrespective of whether you have a disability or not. And secondly, to ensure that we are using accessible technologies. That's there.
Great. Dr. Foster?
Hi. I think the biggest thing that came out of our findings was to consult and give people choice about working in and how they want to work in the future, not make assumptions. There might be an assumption that, maybe our survey says a majority of disabled people prefer to work from home. Well, when we asked them about the future, some people were worried about the future because they were worried they were going to be forced back into the office full time, and that they'd actually settled into a really good routine and become really productive in that routine. Other people were just worried that they wouldn't be given the choice to have some kind of hybrid working arrangement, so that they could spend some of the time in the office, but other amounts of time at home. And I think choice and consultation around the way forward is really, really important, but also getting help, getting expert advice in. The best people to know about what they need are disabled people themselves and disabled people's organizations who, provide a lot of expert knowledge, but a lot of firms and organizations just don't draw on them because they're third sector organizations. And somehow, if they're not going to charge you a big amount of money to come in and do some consultancy for a couple of days, then we don't value them. There are a lot of services out here like Elizabeth's, Law Care, that are experts in these areas. And I think organizations should be drawing on that talent, that pool of talent that's out there as well, and drawing those disabled people in as the real experts with lived experience.
How about you, Elizabeth? We'd love your perspective.
I think thinking about the needs of disabled people, but also people with mental health concerns, and I think everybody in the workplaces, I think what COVID has shown is that one size does not fit all when it comes to supports and programs. And there's a tendency to think, well, we've got this, we've got that, here's this menu, you need to choose something off it. And actually what COVID has done, I think in a positive way in some workplaces, it's opened up that conversation much more about people's individual needs, because you may never have shared in the workplace that your partner is in a vulnerable group and that's why you've needed to shield, or you may not have shared your disability. It may be hidden. You may not have told anybody, but come COVID, you've had to have that conversation. So I think that is a really important message, that we've got to see people as individuals and listen, as Debbie says, listen to what people tell you what their needs are. Don't just assume you know what they are. And I think another big part of this is trust, is that I think it was mentioned right at the beginning, Debbie said in her research, and certainly that's our experience in law care, is generally in the legal sector, there's been a resistance to flexible and home working on the whole, because of all those factors Debbie mentioned, the fact that we've got to be seen, there's presenteeism, the sense that if you're not at your desk, you're not working. And actually what COVID has done, it's shown, I would hope, employers that they can trust their staff. People will do their jobs, and that flexibility gives them, actually, if you get the communications and the trust in place, you can actually empower people to be more productive and more creative by giving them that flexibility. So I think those are two big important things. It's around one size doesn't fit all, and actually trusting and valuing people for what they bring into your organization is so important. And I think COVID has given us that opportunity.
Yeah, that one size fits all thing. I mean, a number of things that everyone said really resonate with me. I mean, the fact that during COVID, even the obvious big picture issues about disability, people with visual impairment, if those aren't taken into account, the fact that actually there's so much nuance when it comes to disability. I mean, so I'm a recent diagnosis with ASD, with autism. But the diagnosis really helps me because so much from my past makes much more sense. But I like structure. I don't like change, particularly fundamental change. I really, because social cues are difficult, having a stable structure really helps me. I have no doubt that post-COVID, working arrangements are going to be different. I can't imagine, at least in the short term, that we're going to go back to being in the office 9 to 5 or whatever it is, 5 days a week, and then everything will be back to how it was. I mean, I think a number of employers were already looking for ways to bring in home working and reduce real estate costs and everything else, even before COVID, and COVID will have accelerated that massively. I don't know how. I mean, if someone asks me now, how do you want to work in a year's time and how's that going to work for you? I have no idea. And if I can't answer that, then how are employers going to know unless that consultation piece is not only big picture stuff, but detailed, nuanced stuff, taking into account everyone? Because one size does not fit all. And then if you cover off key disability, mobility, whatever concerns, you're still going to find people potentially left out.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, Richard. And I think that when we did our legally disabled research, one of the things we found was that a lot of law firms were not very well equipped to deal with disability as a diversity issue. I mean, even things like flexible working were done through, in some firms I talked to, were done through things like they had a general flexible working party or committee that used to look at requests for flexible working rather than regard it as a fundamental reasonable adjustment. And I found that quite disturbing. And if they're at that level of not even understanding that flexible working could be a very reasonable adjustment, that, okay, that was pre-COVID. I do wonder how much expertise already exists in law firms to be able to manage a much more complex, nuanced picture when it's post-COVID, coming into the future, and thinking about how to respond to employee requirements as they emerge. I mean, one of the things that Elizabeth said, I wanted to pick up on, the issue of trust. When we asked in our survey, when we asked disabled lawyers in our survey about levels of trust since lockdown and whether they felt that they were more trusted by their employer to do their job, 80% said they were more trusted to do their job independently. And I think that possibly speaks volumes about the state of the profession before lockdown and how disabled people felt within that profession, that 80% resoundingly said, I've been trusted to get on with my job. Now, at that point, we'd been through lockdown and we'd been through one lift of lockdown when we were asking them this question. So it was quite, it was July, August time. And what we also asked them was, did they feel with that trust, right? The next question was, but do you feel more empowered? And that only came out at about 40%. So I think they were still negotiating the feelings of empowerment, if you see what I mean. It was quite early on in the whole process. And even in the months that have gone since, when we've had roundtables where people have attended and talked about their experiences, they said, yeah, at the very beginning, it was kind of quite difficult because I didn't know what to do with all this responsibility and autonomy and power in, you know, self-responsibility. So I didn't feel empowered. I still felt unsure. And I think we all did, because we were all thrown into a crisis. And it's what comes out of that, you know, what comes out of that in the new normal, when it all settles down and feels much more routine. And I think for disabled people in particular, feeling confident and feeling empowered is something that really needs to be worked on, because they haven't felt empowered in the office a lot of the time. And they felt very undermined in many respects. And this has given them an opportunity. Remember, these are people who often were amongst people who were doing more homeworking than other groups in the workplace, because they asked for it as a reasonable adjustment. It was sometimes refused, but some of them had experience. And suddenly they're shining, you know, because they were already equipped. They were set up at home. They had their offices set up. They were used to Skyping or Zooming. They were used to working remotely. And suddenly they've gone through the experience of feeling like, hey, I know how to do this, and I'm probably better at it than the rest of you. And that's a really different position to be in. And some of them have said that it's been utterly game-changing and liberating for them. But I do also hear people saying that it's also been catastrophic and they felt like a prisoner. So on balance, our survey, and okay, it was only 108 people, and we've had some roundtables since, seemed to say home working was a positive thing. But disabled people also said, I don't want to be ghettoized as a home worker. I want to be fully integrated. So I think this hybrid working future is a really complex one, because it's not just about finding out what everybody needs, you know, what their needs are at work. It's going to also be about integration and making sure that, you know, how do we do a kind of present and remote meeting? How do we ensure that everybody is having the opportunity to participate? And what we found in the roundtables was quite a few firms saying, well, those people who are going into the office are now having meetings in special rooms with Zoom, so that the people are sitting in the office, but they're also Zooming. So the meeting is part Zoom, part office. And that seemed to me like a good idea, because, you know, you had the choices to whether you wanted to be in or not. And I think some of the informal stuff, because we did find some people saying, because although the informal stuff was great for some people, for other people who didn't like the social interaction, it's been wonderful not to have to do it. And they've also felt like they've been treated a bit more fairly and evenly, because it hasn't been the person who you pass in the corridor or have the chat with around the, you know, at the end of the meeting, or around the I'm trying to think of the word, the cooler, the drinks cooler, or anything like that. You know, those informal interactions where you might have got to hear about an opportunity that's coming up. Some senior people have said, actually, I've sat down and I've thought, am I fair in allocating that piece of work to so-and-so? I should be more balanced about the opportunities that I'm giving out here. And I think that's interesting, because it feeds into all the debates about unconscious bias. Are we being more reflective because we're isolated? I mean, we as senior people might be more isolated in the way that we're treating people that we're managing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. That's an interesting thought too. I want to toss this over to Vibhu and ask a question, and to the panelists. You know, Vibhu, do you think that there's an unattended? We've already spoken about how you think that reasonable people have been more receptive.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm sorry, that it seems like the thing is speaking. There have been unintended consequences of the pandemic, but people have become maybe more receptive to conversations about reasonable accommodations and reasonable adjustments. You know, things happen so quickly and overnight, and I wondered, you know, what your thoughts were. Have you seen employers being more receptive to requests for reasonable accommodations, and also, you know, those people who maybe never identified before as having a disability coming forward and, you know, talking about their needs? Have you been seeing that or heard much about it?
I think the pandemic should have certainly done some of those things, because we have been talking so much about teleworking everywhere now, and it's been everybody who has been teleworking now. But one difference that I see before the pandemic and now in the post-pandemic world or during the pandemic world is that so, I mean, generally speaking, 95% of the times you see that a lot of the accommodations that are requested to employers are actually by their so-called non-disabled employees. So, for example, a non-disabled employee might ask you for flexible working hours or for a flexible working schedule, or to telecommute, or ask to make modifications to their workstations. The thing is that as long as it's the non-disabled employees requesting them, employers did not see them as reasonable accommodations. They would see them as minor adjustments or add-ons that they should provide to their employees to enhance their productivity. But and it became a problem when an employee with disability asked you for the same things, because then employers would start thinking of them as reasonable accommodations. So now I think a lot of those myths should be cleared, because everybody is teleworking, and non-disabled employees are teleworking, just like employees with disabilities. So it should not matter. So at the same time, I'm aware that certain organizations had actually provided equipment support to their employees, office furniture, ergonomic chairs, keyboards, other devices. And you might be providing the same to employees with disabilities as well. So it does not really make any difference. But I think essentially what would be very important in the post-pandemic world for us to understand would be, well, we are in 2020, soon to transition to 2021. And we need to be thinking of solutions or workplace adjustments that respond to everybody, that just do not respond to the 85% of the world's population who is not disabled, but things that respond to 100% of our workforce and 100% of the world's population. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit more about mental health? I mean, we've talked about the experiences of people during the pandemic. Going forwards, in a hybrid workplace, are there any mental health challenges, do we think, that that poses, that either we have to work out how to adjust to, or that we need to anticipate the impact? Anyone got any opinions on that?
Sorry, Richard, did you direct it on me?
No, just anyone.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting and challenging question to answer, because I think there are going to be mental health consequences for all of us as a result of COVID. It's going to have a long tail, I think, as we adjust to new ways of working. And I think the challenge for all organizations is to actually look at what are the positive learnings that we've had from this experience? What are the things we've learned from COVID about ourselves, our colleagues, the way we manage, the way we set our legal firms up, that we can take from this to actually make things better? This is a great opportunity to address some of the challenges we have in the law. We know that lawyers have higher rates of stress, anxiety, and depression when compared to the general public. The question is, why is that? It's partly down to the thinking styles of lawyers, all those things that make us great lawyers: rumination, perfectionism, autonomy, wanting more of it than perhaps we always have, meeting the expectations of clients, the highly pressured environment, the 24/7 culture. You put the thinking styles of lawyers together with the working environment, you create a perfect storm. COVID has provided an opportunity to rethink all of that. And I think the organizations that emerge from this in a strong place will be the ones who have thought about what the future is going to be like. It's not going to happen overnight. We're going to have to acclimatize, invest more in the management training of their staff. I think that's a challenge in law for mental health. Most people who manage people in the law have had no or little training in it. The people who become managers are the ones who are great lawyers, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're very good at handling people. And I think there's going to be, in terms of getting more directly onto the question, is the hybrid thing, is, you know, as human beings, we are social animals. We like interaction with other people in some shape or form. And I think part of successful organizations that have mentally healthy workplaces are where people feel valued, trusted, they're part of something, there's a shared sense of purpose. And how you achieve that, I think, in a hybrid world is a challenge, but you're always, I think, going to have opportunities where you bring people together face to face, because it would be very challenging, I think, to have a part of your organization, people who always work remotely and no one ever else meets them. How are you going to build up trust with colleagues if you've never met them in the real world and you've not had those little micro interactions that we have day in, day out that help us build those relationships? And I think also recognizing the signs of when people are struggling is harder remotely. And a big challenge for lawyers is around supervision, and asking for help when you feel you're struggling is a difficulty, because lawyers, you know, we feel we solve other people's problems, we don't have any of our own. And so how in a remote world where you may have people more distanced, can you pick up on those cues that something's not quite right? It's probably easier to almost ignore it than you would perhaps in the real world. So I think that's a challenge. But that's not to say these can't be surmounted, because I'm sure there will be tons of debate about this. There'll be lots of resources out there as we all adjust to it. And I see this as a great opportunity to actually improve the mental health in the legal profession by looking at taking the best learnings from COVID and putting those into the workplace moving forward.
Yeah, I was going to say that we had a conversation, myself and Elizabeth, and I think you were there, Richard, about humanizing the workplace, and the fact that because of COVID, more people are having conversations about how do you feel, and emotional intelligence and being more emotionally reactive as an organization is really, really important. And I think we could build on some of the lessons of COVID, because people have had conversations they may never have had before with things like line managers and supervisors who have said, you know, are you okay? And at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, lots of emails came around saying, hope you are okay, hope you are well, before they say anything else, because we were never too sure. Whereas before, when we were in the workplace, it was assumed that everybody was well. And that was a real pressure on people who had medical conditions, because they were always putting on a face. They were always going to work and pretending that everything was fine, because it wasn't on for them to reveal that it wasn't all right behind the scenes. And, you know, I'm hoping that there'll be more honest conversations, and that the culture of organizations will become more humane and reactive and emotionally intelligent. And I don't see why that shouldn't happen, but I think it needs to be it needs to be nurtured, and there need to be people taking it forward who know what they're doing. One thing I wanted to say was that one of the things in our survey was a lot of disabled people said that they belonged more. And I know there's this feeling that culture of an organization can only be solidified if you're present, but they felt that they were participating in meetings, in training, in staff development, in discussions, in socials, in buddying, in a way, and mentoring in a way they'd never participated before. They no longer felt like outsiders, they felt like they belonged. So I think, again, it points to a variety and multitude of different experiences, but we could take some of those good things and build on them. And that's what I'd like to see in the future.
So Vicky, you've joined us to tell us that our time's up. Vibhu, I don't know if you've got anything to add very quickly before we're kicked off.
No, I would just echo all of that. And I think, I mean, obviously social isolation is one of the major things causing mental health issues. The CNN reported over here in America already this week that there were more people who died of a suicide in entire 2020 than of the coronavirus. And I think, I mean, obviously we all can speculate that the reason behind the suicides would be or could be the mental health issues which are now coming up, because the coronavirus is not just being a medical issue, it's also being a mental health issue. So I think, but along with social isolation, I think what could be contributing to mental health problems is also boundaries between personal and professional becoming blur, and people might just be working extra hours and not being credited for it, and they might end up thinking that, well, I had to spend these many extra hours because I wasn't competent enough to finish my work in the stipulated time. Expenses for people who are in low-paying jobs or beginners could be another reason, because then they might have to spend money on getting them accommodations that they otherwise had access to within the office environment. But I think at the end of the day, what is really important for us is to acknowledge that in certain communities or in certain countries, talking about mental health is still a taboo. So there might be a lot of people who might be feeling certain mental health issues or extremely stressed out, but then they might not be able to talk about it. So I think it's important that when organizations are interacting with their employees or with their associates, we have that sort of a mechanism in place wherein we are asking people how they are doing, we are encouraging them to talk about their issues, and we have ample resources and networks and employee resource programs that are dedicated to mental health and that everybody has access to, so that they have ample resources at hand if they need to have something at hand. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. I thought that was fascinating. And I'll hand over to Vicky.
Thanks so much, panel 3. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague in London, Tamara Box, for closing remarks. Tamara is a leading lawyer in our structured finance team and the managing partner of Reed Smith's Europe and Middle East offices. She's also an active member of the firm's Leaders Business Inclusion Group. Thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, Vicky. And thank you for being such a fabulous compere for us. It's been a wonderful, wonderful event. I'm so pleased that Reed Smith determined to have this event and this summit in this year of all years. One in which, as we've heard today, it's been difficult for so many people for so many reasons. But we've also heard, and I truly believe it, that there are real reasons for optimism about the future for disability inclusion. As with many trends, the pandemic has accelerated the trend toward flexible working, And of course, the ability to work more flexibly, as we've heard, breaks down yet another perceived barrier to the employment of people with disabilities. In addition, frankly, the trend toward more honest and open conversations like the ones that we've had today can only help us make more strides toward valuing our differences and toward inclusion and indeed equality. I'm also hugely optimistic about the future, frankly, because of the vision that's provided by the incredibly talented people with disabilities and our allies who've joined us today. Indeed, our thanks go very much to our keynote speaker, Victoria Cleland. Thank you. And also to our amazing speakers and panelists, many of whom we know had competing demands on their time today. And so we are very grateful that they chose to spend this time with us. We featured a number of our STAR associates with disabilities who are current and future leaders in every sense of the word. It is they who put our panels together, who moderated them in many cases, and who in all ways were responsible for organizing this event. Our thanks therefore go to Daniel Liebel, Kevin Hara, and Jonathan Andrews in particular for all they do as fantastic lawyers in our firm, but also for the road that they are paving for others who will surely follow in their footsteps, certainly here at Reed Smith and hopefully in law firms around the globe. I want to thank our wonderful marketing team of Kate Dunn and Mackenzie Beckel, who worked very hard to put this event together with us. And finally, last but never ever least, I want to express our appreciation of and our gratitude to the brilliant associate Vaibhav Adlaka. This event is his brainchild. He has worked tirelessly and with enormous passion to make today happen. I can attest personally to how infectious his enthusiasm is. We know that disability inclusion still has a long way to go, but with all that we've heard today, I really am optimistic, and I know it is my favorite word, that we are accelerating rapidly toward that destination. So thank you for joining us all. Take care.